Mason Blackwood froze mid-stride, his weathered hand gripping the radio so tightly his knuckles blanched white. The desperate, high-pitched cry carried on the hot Texas wind wasn't just any animal in distress. It was a Brahman bull calf, with a voice that awakened ghosts he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Luke stumbled to a halt beside him, coffee thermos clattering against the truck door as the young ranger's eyes widened in alarm. "That's coming from the ravine near Sterling's property line," he whispered. Eleanor's warnings about the drought driving the last purebred Blackwood Brahmins into dangerous territory echoed in Mason's mind. The same magnificent beasts his father had died trying to protect. The same bloodline that should have disappeared when Sterling Mining swallowed his family's ranch. "Get the rescue gear," Mason commanded, even as his heart raced with contradiction, running toward the very creatures that had haunted his nightmares. What waited in that ravine? And why, after all these years, had the past returned to claim him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The harsh Texas sun beat down on Stone Creek County like a blacksmith's hammer, unrelenting and merciless in its 5th month of drought. What had once been rolling green pastures was now a patchwork of dusty browns and withered yellows. Creeks had shrunk to trickles, cattle ponds to muddy divots, and the once proud Colorado River had retreated from its banks, exposing cracked earth like ancient wounds. Mason Blackwood knew this land better than most. At 42, the lines around his eyes told stories of squinting into too many sunsets, searching horizons for storms that rarely came. His father had called him hawk-eyed as a boy, able to spot a limping calf from half a mile away. Now those same eyes scanned the ravine below, seeking movement, seeking life. 15 years as a ranger, and I've never seen it this dry, he muttered, adjusting his worn Stetson. The hat, like the man, had weathered too many seasons but refused to quit. Mason had not always worn the olive-green uniform of the Stone Creek Conservation Rangers. Once he'd been Dr. Blackwood, a respected large animal veterinarian whose gentle hands had saved countless creatures. That was before the incident with the Hargrove prize bull, before he'd chosen the animal's suffering over the owner's demands to let it die. His license suspension had been temporary, but his disgrace in ranching circles permanent. Beside him stood Luke Davidson, 27, eager and untested. The kind of young man who still polished his badge each morning and pressed his uniform with military precision. His family had worked the smaller farms around Stone Creek for generations, always one dry season away from bankruptcy. "Mason, we should call this in before heading down there," Luke suggested, eyes darting nervously toward the ridge where massive shapes had begun to appear, the distinctive humped silhouettes of Brahman bulls. "Eleanor needs to know if it's them," Mason replied, referring to Eleanor Chambers, the 72-year-old director of the conservation area and the closest thing to a mother he'd had since returning to Stone Creek. Eleanor ran the Stone Creek Conservation Area with the fierce determination of someone who understood that some battles couldn't be postponed. The arthritis in her hands hadn't slowed her down, nor had the quiet cough that had become more persistent in recent months. What few outsiders realized was that this patch of protected land represented the last stand against Victor Sterling and Sterling Mining. The old man's company had already consumed 3/4 of Stone Creek County, including the once legendary Blackwood Ranch, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land that had been in Mason's family for 4 generations before the banks foreclosed and Sterling swooped in. The mining operation promised jobs and prosperity, but delivered scarred landscapes and broken promises. Eleanor fought them with paperwork and passion, while Mason fought them by preserving what remained of the wildlife Sterling seemed determined to displace. As Mason prepared to descend into the ravine, his radio crackled to life. "Mason, it's Eleanor," Don't do anything foolish. Those bulls, if they're Joseph's bloodline, they're the last evidence we have. Be careful, son." Mason clipped the radio back to his belt, the weight of her words heavier than the rescue gear on his shoulders. Some battles couldn't be postponed, but some wounds never fully healed. The descent into the ravine was treacherous, loose shale sliding beneath Mason's boots with each careful step. The cry came again, weaker this time, sending a chill down his spine despite the oppressive heat. "Easy does it," Mason called back to Luke, who followed several paces behind, awkwardly balancing the rescue equipment. "This whole area could give way if we're not careful." Mason's mind drifted back to his childhood, his father's deep voice echoing across decades. "Brahman bulls aren't like other cattle, son. God gave them that hump to store water, gave them those ears to cool their blood. They can survive where others perish. Remember that, Blackwoods and Brahmins, we endure." Joseph Blackwood had been a living legend in Stone Creek County, a third-generation rancher whose prize Brahman bulls fetched top dollar at auctions across Texas. Mason had been groomed to take over the ranch someday, to continue the legacy. Instead, he'd chosen veterinary school, wanting to heal rather than raise, a decision that had driven the first wedge between father and son. "Mason, look there!" Luke's voice snapped him back to the present. In a narrow section where the ravine walls pinched inward, a Brahman calf lay trapped. Its coat, normally a sleek silver gray, was caked with dust and streaked with blood. One of its hind legs was wedged between fallen rocks, and its head lolled weakly as it tried to lift it at the sound of their approach. "Sweet Lord," Mason breathed, quickening his pace. As he drew closer, his trained eye catalogued the calf's condition: dehydration, exhaustion, possible fracture of the right hind limb. But it was the distinctive marking on its ear that stopped him cold, a triangular notch cut into the right ear, the Blackwood brand. "That's impossible," he whispered. "They were all sold. Every last one." "What's that?" Luke asked, setting down the equipment. Mason knelt carefully beside the calf, speaking in low, soothing tones. "This calf has my family's marking, the Blackwood notch." His fingers gently traced the triangular cut. "My father's herd was supposed to have been sold off years ago when Sterling took the land." The calf's eyes, large and liquid brown, fixed on Mason with the particular blend of fear and hope that only a trapped animal can express. Mason reached for his canteen, carefully pouring a small amount of water into his cupped hand and offering it to the parched animal. The calf lapped weakly at the moisture. "Someone's been maintaining the herd," Mason said, more to himself than to Luke. "Keeping the bloodline pure, using the old markings." A movement above them caught Mason's attention. Silhouetted against the harsh sky stood a massive bull, its characteristic hump prominent even from this distance. Behind it, several other Brahmins appeared along the ridge, cows and younger bulls forming a protective semicircle. The lead bull pawed at the ground, a clear warning. "Mason," Luke's voice had dropped to a whisper, "we've got company. Big company." "I see them," Mason replied, not taking his eyes off the trapped calf. "That's the herd bull. He's protecting his family." He risked a glance upward. 2,000 pounds of protective instinct standing between us and safety. As Mason assessed their predicament, his boot nudged something half buried in the ravine floor, a coil of rusted barbed wire and fragments of old metal pipe, carelessly dumped. He scraped away some dirt with his knife, revealing more debris. "This is Sterling mining garbage," he said, anger edging his voice. "They've been using this ravine as an illegal dump site. This poor calf probably came down for water and got trapped in their mess." Luke pulled out his phone, seemingly checking the time. "Weather Service says there's a storm front moving in from the west. We probably have 3 hours before it hits." Mason caught something in Luke's tone, a nervousness beyond the obvious danger of their situation. The younger ranger had been checking his phone repeatedly throughout the morning, each time claiming to monitor the weather. "Why don't you call it in?" Mason suggested, watching Luke's reaction carefully. "Let Eleanor know what we've found, especially about the Blackwood marking." Luke hesitated a fraction too long before nodding. "Sure thing. I'll step back up to get better reception." As Luke climbed back toward the rim of the ravine, Mason's radio crackled to life. Eleanor's voice came through, thin but determined. "Mason, come in. Radar's showing a thunderstorm building west of you. These summer storms can trigger flash floods in those ravines. Whatever you're doing, you need to wrap it up soon." Mason pressed the talk button. "Eleanor, we found a trapped calf. But there's something else. It's carrying the Blackwood notch. My father's marking." A long pause followed. Then Eleanor's voice returned, softer now. "I was afraid of this. Mason, listen to me carefully. That calf is more important than you realize. If Sterling's people find it first—" The radio cut off abruptly as a shadow fell across Mason. He looked up to see Luke returning, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor says a storm's coming," Mason said, watching Luke's face. "We need to work fast." The calf made another pitiful sound, weaker than before. Mason ran experienced hands over its body, assessing the damage. The leg wasn't broken, thankfully, but badly bruised and swollen. The real danger was dehydration and heat exposure. "We need to move these rocks carefully," Mason instructed. "The wrong shift could crush its leg completely." They worked methodically, Mason directing Luke to position the hydraulic jack from their rescue kit. Above them, the bull herd had grown more restless, the lead bull occasionally emitting a low, rumbling bellow that reverberated through the ravine. "My father used to say you could judge a man by how he treats an animal in distress," Mason said, carefully wedging a support under a precariously balanced rock. "He'd stay up all night with a sick calf, talking to it, keeping it fighting." "What happened to him?" Luke asked, seemingly genuinely interested. Everyone in town knows the Blackwood name, but nobody talks much about how it all ended. Mason's jaw tightened. "Heart attack, officially. But he died the day Sterling Mining foreclosed on our ranch. Dad had taken loans to expand the breeding program, Brahman bulls that could withstand the changing climate. When the drought of '05 hit, the banks called in their notes. Dad couldn't pay." He paused, the memory still raw. Victor Sterling offered to help, buy a portion of the land to give Dad operating capital. But once Sterling had his foot in the door, suddenly the water rights were disputed, grazing permits denied. One by one, Sterling boxed him in until there was nowhere to go but bankruptcy. A rumble of thunder in the distance punctuated his words, the promised storm making its approach known. Dad always said Victor Sterling wanted Blackwood Ranch because of what lay beneath it, not what grazed on top. 3 months after we lost the ranch, the first mining equipment rolled in. Mason's voice had grown quiet. He died, watching them tear up his pastures from the window of a rented room in town. The calf stirred beneath Mason's hands, drawing him back to the present crisis. As they worked to free it, Mason spotted something metallic glinting in the ravine wall, partially exposed by recent erosion. He brushed away the dirt to reveal an old boundary marker, a metal plate stamped with Blackwood and a survey number. Mason stared at it, confusion furrowing his brow. "This doesn't make sense. According to Sterling's property maps, this ravine is a quarter-mile inside their mining lease." "Maybe the maps are wrong," Luke suggested, a little too quickly. "Or maybe they were changed," Mason replied, his suspicion growing. "Luke, take a picture of this marker. We need to document exactly where we found it." Luke reluctantly raised his phone, but before he could take the photo, the device buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and quickly declined it, but not before Mason caught the name displayed. V. Sterling. The realization hit Mason like a physical blow. Luke was Sterling's informant, reporting their movements, perhaps specifically tasked with tracking Mason. The betrayal stung, but there was no time to address it now. The calf needed them, and the storm was approaching. "Let's focus on freeing this calf," Mason said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger churning inside. "Then we can sort out where property lines really fall." As they positioned the jack to lift the largest rock pinning the calf's leg, the radio crackled again. This time it wasn't Eleanor's voice, but the conservation area's dispatcher. "All field personnel be advised. Flash flood warning issued for Stone Creek County. All ravines and low-lying areas to be evacuated immediately. Repeat, flash flood warning in effect." Mason glanced at the sky where dark clouds had begun to build on the western horizon. They had less time than he'd thought. The decision now was stark. Abandon the rescue and ensure their own safety, or stay and risk being caught in a potential flash flood. For Mason Blackwood, it wasn't really a decision at all. He'd lost his veterinary license because he refused to abandon an animal in distress. He wouldn't start now. "We're staying," he said firmly, adjusting the jack. "This calf is coming home with us." Luke's eyes widened. "Mason, flash floods in these ravines can come without warning. The storm could be dumping rain miles from here, and we'd never know until the wall of water hits us." "Then we better work fast," Mason replied, not looking up from his task. "This calf is carrying my family's mark. I'm not leaving it to drown." As if understanding the stakes, the calf made another effort to free itself, its movement more determined now. The herd bull above let out another warning bellow, this one louder and more insistent. The message was clear. Time was running out, one way or another. The first attempt to free the calf ended in near disaster. As Mason carefully operated the hydraulic jack, the surrounding rocks shifted unexpectedly. A cascade of smaller stones broke loose, forcing him to dive backward, narrowly avoiding being crushed. "Damn it!" Mason scrambled back to his feet, dust coating his uniform. "The whole ledge is unstable." Above them, the led Brahman bull's agitation intensified. It pawed the ground with increasing force, sending small avalanches of dirt and pebbles down the ravine walls. The massive creature lowered its head, the characteristic hump between its shoulders seeming to rise even higher as muscles tensed beneath its silver-gray hide. "Mason, we need to back off," Luke urged, eyeing the bull nervously. "That bull's about to charge, and if he comes down that slope, there's nowhere for us to go." Mason knew Luke was right about the danger, but something kept him rooted in place. Perhaps the same stubborn determination that had cost him his veterinary license years ago. The calf's eyes, wide with fear yet somehow trusting, held his gaze. "We're not giving up," Mason said firmly. "We just need a different approach." As they reassessed their strategy, Mason's mind drifted back to the day everything changed for the Blackwoods. He'd been away at veterinary school when his father called, voice uncharacteristically broken. "They're taking it all, son," Joseph had said. "Sterling's lawyers found a clause in the water rights agreement. Without water access, the bank says the land's worthless as collateral. They're foreclosing next week." Mason had rushed home to find his father sitting on the porch, staring out at the pastures where generations of Blackwood Brahmins had grazed. The proud man seemed diminished, aged a decade in a month. "I tried to fight them, Mason. God knows I tried. But Sterling's got judges in his pocket and bankers at his beck and call." When Mason suggested legal action, Joseph had just shaken his head. "You can't fight a man who rewrites the rules as he goes. Sterling wants what's under this land, not what's on it. Always has." A week later, they'd watched as the prized Blackwood herd, over 60 head of the finest Brahman cattle in Texas, was loaded onto trailers for auction. Joseph's face had been stone, but Mason saw how his hands trembled. 3 months later, Joseph Blackwood was dead. The official cause was heart failure, but everyone in Stone Creek knew the truth. Joseph died of a broken heart, watching mining equipment tear up land his family had stewarded for generations. The sound of an approaching vehicle pulled Mason from his bitter memories. A conservation area jeep appeared at the ravine's edge, and Eleanor Chambers carefully emerged, moving with the deliberate precision of someone managing constant pain but determined not to show it. "Thought you boys might need some reinforcements?" she called down, her voice stronger than her thin frame suggested. Behind her, another ranger unloaded additional rescue equipment. Mason felt a complicated surge of emotion, relief at the help, concern for Eleanor exerting herself in this heat, and wariness about what her unexpected arrival might mean. "Eleanor, you shouldn't be out here in this heat," Mason called up. "The storm's coming in fast." "I've weathered worse than a little summer shower, Mason Blackwood," she replied with characteristic stubbornness. "Now tell me about this calf." Mason described the situation while Eleanor listened intently, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. When he mentioned the Blackwood notch, she nodded as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "I've been tracking this herd for months," she revealed, making her way carefully down a gentler section of the ravine. "They appeared on conservation land back in April. 27 head of purebred Brahman cattle wearing your father's mark." Mason stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. The herd was sold off. I watched them go." Eleanor reached the bottom of the ravine, slightly breathless from the exertion. "Your father was many things, Mason, but a fool wasn't one of them. What Sterling and the bank saw that day was most of the herd, not all of it." Luke had moved away during this exchange, ostensibly to secure more equipment, but Mason noticed him pull out his phone again, thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. Eleanor continued, her voice lowered. "Joseph managed to hide his best breeding stock, 2 bulls and 8 heifers, on the far section of the ranch, the rough country that borders what's now the conservation area. By the time Sterling's people realized some cattle were missing, the paperwork was done, and those animals were, officially, already sold." Mason processed this revelation. "You're saying my father hid part of his herd? And they've been living wild all these years?" "Not entirely wild," Eleanor corrected. "Someone's been looking after them, making sure they have winter feed when necessary, keeping track of calving, maintaining the bloodline." Her eyes held his meaningfully. "Your father's legacy didn't end when Sterling took the ranch, Mason." Before Mason could ask who had been caring for the cattle, a low moan from the calf drew their attention back to the immediate crisis. The animal's condition was deteriorating rapidly in the heat. "We need to try again," Mason said, refocusing on the rescue. "Eleanor, did you bring a backboard? If we can free the leg, we'll need to immobilize it for transport." With Eleanor directing operations from above and the additional ranger helping, they prepared for a second rescue attempt. This time, they would approach from a different angle, using a more stable section of rock as leverage. As they worked, Eleanor kept a watchful eye on the bull herd. "That lead bull, he's from your father's prime stock. Look at the breadth of his chest, the set of those horns. That's Thunderhead's bloodline." Mason glanced up, recognition dawning. Thunderhead had been his father's prize breeding bull, a massive Brahman with a distinctive pattern of darker gray across his shoulders. This bull indeed carried those same markings. "Thunderhead's son," Mason murmured. "He'd be about the right age." As they positioned the equipment for another attempt, Mason noticed the calf was more injured than they'd initially thought. Beyond the trapped leg, it showed signs of poor health, unusual lesions on its hide, and a yellowish tinge to the whites of its eyes. "Eleanor, look at this!" Mason called, pointing out the symptoms. "These aren't injuries from being trapped. This calf is sick." Eleanor leaned in to examine the animal, her expression grave. "I've been seeing similar symptoms in wildlife near Sterling's mining operation. The deer, particularly." A troubling suspicion formed in Mason's mind. Water contamination? Eleanor nodded grimly. "I've been trying to get the environmental agency to test the runoff, but Sterling's lawyers keep blocking access. They claim it's proprietary information related to their extraction process." While they talked, Luke had disappeared again, supposedly to retrieve more supplies from the vehicles. Mason watched him through narrowed eyes, increasingly certain of the young ranger's divided loyalties. As they prepared to free the calf, Mason spotted something else embedded in the ravine wall, partially exposed by recent erosion. He brushed away the loose dirt to reveal an old metal stake with a tarnished brass cap, an original Blackwood Ranch boundary marker. "Eleanor," he called, confusion evident in his voice. "This marker puts us well inside the old Blackwood property line." Eleanor made her way over, examining the marker closely. "That's because we are on Blackwood land, Mason. According to the original survey maps, this entire ravine system was part of your family's eastern pasture. But Sterling's property maps show what Sterling wants them to show," Eleanor finished for him. "Your father suspected the boundary markers had been tampered with before the foreclosure. It's one of the reasons he hid those cattle here. He knew this was still legally Blackwood land, regardless of what Sterling's surveyors claimed." The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the boundary markers had been deliberately moved or misrepresented in official documents, it could invalidate Sterling's claim to significant portions of what was now mining land. Thunder rumbled closer now, the storm front approaching faster than predicted. Dark clouds had swallowed the western sky, and the air had taken on the electric quality that precedes a major Texas thunderstorm. "We need to work fast," Mason said, glancing at the darkening sky. "That storm's picking up speed." As they positioned the hydraulic jack for another attempt, Luke returned, his expression tense. "The Weather Service upgraded the storm warning," he reported. "They're predicting 3 inches of rain in the next 2 hours. "Then we have less time than I thought," Mason replied, watching Luke carefully. The young ranger's nervousness seemed to have increased, his eyes darting frequently to the ridgeline as if expecting someone. They began the delicate process of lifting the rocks pinning the calf's leg. This time, with the additional equipment and help, they made steady progress. The calf, sensing freedom was near, renewed its efforts to escape, its movements becoming more animated despite its weakened condition. Above them, the bull herd had grown increasingly restless. The lead bull's warnings had become more frequent, its massive head swinging from side to side as it tracked their movements. The cows had gathered closer to the edge, some with calves pressed protectively against their sides. "They're getting ready to move," Eleanor observed. "They can sense the storm coming better than any weather radar." Just as they began to make real progress with freeing the calf, the distinctive sound of an approaching helicopter cut through the air. Mason looked up to see a white chopper with the Sterling Mining logo emblazoned on its side circling overhead. Luke's radio crackled to life. "Davidson, this is Sterling Security. Do you have a situation down there? We spotted your vehicles from the air." Before Luke could respond, Mason grabbed the radio. "This is Senior Ranger Blackwood from Stone Creek Conservation. We're conducting a wildlife rescue operation. Your helicopter is disturbing the animals. Please withdraw." There was a pause before the reply came. "Ranger Blackwood, you're currently on Sterling Mining property. Our security team will be there shortly to assist you in vacating the area." Mason looked at Eleanor, whose expression had hardened. "They're moving fast," she said quietly. "Someone must have tipped them off about what we found." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Luke. The helicopter continued circling, the downwash kicking up dust and further agitating the bull herd. The lead bull began moving along the ridge, clearly searching for a path down to the ravine floor. "We're out of time," Mason said urgently. We need to get this calf free now. With a final coordinated effort, they managed to lift the rocks enough for the calf to pull its leg free. The animal struggled to its feet, wobbling unsteadily but alive. Mason quickly examined the injured leg, bruised and swollen, but miraculously no broken bones. "Good girl," he murmured, running a gentle hand along the calf's trembling flank. "You're tougher than you look." Their triumph was short-lived. The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the opposite end of the ravine, where two Sterling mining security SUVs had appeared, kicking up dust as they bounced over the rough terrain. At the same moment, the lead bull found its path. With surprising agility for such a massive animal, it began descending a game trail that switchbacked down the ravine wall, its intention clear: reclaim its calf and eliminate the threat. "Mason!" Eleanor's voice was urgent. "We need to go. Now." The situation had deteriorated from complicated to potentially deadly in seconds. Behind them, Sterling security personnel were approaching on foot. Above and now partially down the ravine wall, 2,000 pounds of protective bull instinct was charging toward them. And overhead, the storm clouds had begun to release their first heavy drops of rain, pattering against the dusty ravine floor like ominous drumbeats. The calf, sensing its herd nearby, let out a stronger cry than before, a call that its mother immediately answered from the ridgeline. The response seemed to fuel the lead bull's determination as it navigated the steep trail with increasing speed. "Get the calf up the path," Mason ordered, making a split-second decision. "I'll hold off Sterling's men." But before anyone could move, a familiar voice called from the edge of the ravine, "Mason Blackwood!" Still playing hero with other people's property? Mason looked up to see a woman in a crisp business suit standing next to one of the Sterling vehicles. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but there was no mistaking the Blackwood eyes, the same shade of green as his own. "Sarah," Mason acknowledged, a complex mix of emotions coloring his voice as he faced his estranged sister for the first time in nearly 5 years. Sarah Blackwood, now Sterling Mining's legal counsel, surveyed the scene with cold professionalism. "You're trespassing on company property, Mason. Again, I suggest you leave before I have security escort you out." The family reunion would have to wait. The first heavy drops of rain had given way to a steadier downpour, and water was already beginning to collect in the ravine bottom. The bull had reached a ledge just 30 yards away and paused, assessing the humans surrounding its calf. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying surprising authority despite the intensifying storm. "Sarah Blackwood, you know as well as I do that these boundary markers put us on contested land. Your father believed—" "My father believed a lot of things," Sarah cut her off sharply. "Most of them fantasies that cost us everything." She gestured to the security team. "Remove them from the property. All of them." The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury. Lightning split the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. The rain intensified from steady to torrential in seconds, and the trickle forming in the ravine bottom suddenly surged with runoff. The bull, startled by the thunder, let out a bellow that seemed to shake the very walls of the ravine and charged the remaining distance toward them. In the chaos of thunder, rain, and the approaching security team, Mason made the only choice he could. He scooped up the weakened calf in his arms and shouted to Eleanor, "Run! Head for the high ground!" The next few moments were pure chaos. The bull, focused solely on reclaiming its calf, charged directly at Mason. With the animal in his arms, he couldn't move quickly enough to escape. Just as the bull closed the final distance, Luke unexpectedly stepped into its path, waving his arms and shouting to divert its attention. The distraction worked too well. The bull adjusted its charge toward Luke, who barely managed to scramble behind a boulder as 2,000 pounds of angry Brahmin crashed past him. "Luke!" Mason shouted, but his voice was lost in the storm. Eleanor grabbed Mason's arm, pointing urgently toward a narrow side channel that offered a potential escape route. "There! That leads back to conservation land." With the calf clutched against his chest, Mason followed Eleanor toward the escape route, the water now ankle-deep and rising rapidly around them. Behind them, the bull had circled back and was now confronting the Sterling security team, effectively blocking their pursuit. Sarah's voice carried over the storm one last time. "Mason, this isn't over!" As they scrambled up the side channel, the rain continued to intensify, turning the dry ravine into a raging stream before their eyes. The true danger was no longer the bull or Sterling security team. It was the flash flood that would soon make the entire ravine system impassable. They had escaped one trap only to face an even deadlier one. The side channel narrowed as they climbed, water surging around their boots with increasing force. Mason cradled the calf against his chest, its frightened heartbeat pulsing against his own. Behind them, the main ravine had transformed from dusty creek bed to churning torrent in mere minutes, the flash flood gathering strength with each passing second. "There's an old line shack about half a mile up this draw," Eleanor shouted over the storm's fury. "If we can reach it, we'll have shelter until this passes." Rain pelted them mercilessly, turning the ground beneath their feet into treacherous mud. The calf in Mason's arms was surprisingly calm now, as if sensing these humans represented its best chance for survival. Its large brown eyes, so like those of the Brahmin cattle his father had raised, watched Mason with what he could only interpret as trust. "What about Luke?" Mason called to Eleanor, guilt gnawing at him despite his suspicions about the young ranger's divided loyalties. "He knows these lands," Eleanor replied, her breath coming in labored gasps as they climbed. "He'll head for high ground if he has any sense." They pushed onward, the physical exertion taking an obvious toll on Eleanor. Mason noticed her pausing more frequently, one hand pressed against her side, her face contorted in barely concealed pain. "Eleanor, we need to rest," Mason insisted during one such pause. She shook her head stubbornly. "No time. That water's rising faster than I've ever seen." She gestured toward the ravine below, where the flood had already claimed the spot where they'd freed the calf mere minutes ago. As they continued their ascent, Mason's mind turned to Sarah's unexpected appearance. His sister had changed dramatically from the passionate young woman who had once helped him nurse sick calves through long nights. Now she wore Sterling Mining's authority like armor, her once warm eyes hardened by ambition or perhaps something darker. Their last significant conversation had been at their father's funeral. While Mason had blamed Sterling for their father's death, Sarah had directed her anger elsewhere. "Dad was weak," she'd said, her voice cold as she stood beside their father's grave. "He could have partnered with Sterling, secured our future. Instead, he clung to sentimentality until it killed him." Mason had been stunned by her bitterness. Dad stood by his principles. The ranch wasn't just land to him. It was our heritage, our responsibility. Sarah had laughed, a hollow sound. "Principles don't pay bills, Mason. While you were playing doctor, I watched him reject offer after offer that could have saved us." They'd barely spoken since. 2 years later, when Mason returned to Stone Creek after his suspension, he'd discovered Sarah working for Sterling Mining's legal department. The final betrayal, as far as he was concerned. A clap of thunder directly overhead jarred Mason back to the present crisis. The storm was intensifying, sheets of rain reducing visibility to mere yards. The calf shivered against him, its initial calmness giving way to tremors that worried the former veterinarian in him. "The shack should be just ahead," Eleanor called, pointing toward a bend in the draw. "Joseph built it as a line camp back when this was all Blackwood Range." As they rounded the bend, Mason's heart sank. Where a shelter should have stood, only a partial stone foundation remained, the wooden structure long since collapsed into weathered boards scattered by time and elements. "Damn," Eleanor muttered, surveying the ruins. Sterling's people must have torn it down when they were surveying. The loss of their expected shelter was a serious blow. The storm showed no signs of abating, and they were both soaked to the skin. More concerning was the calf's condition. Its shivering had intensified, and Mason recognized the early signs of shock. "We need to get this animal warm and dry," he said, professional instincts taking over. "And we need to examine that leg properly." Eleanor scanned their surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades learning the land's secrets. "There," she said, pointing to an outcropping of limestone that created a natural overhang. "It's not perfect, but it'll block the worst of the rain." They made their way to the modest shelter, where Mason gently set the calf down on the driest patch of ground. From her pack, Eleanor produced an emergency thermal blanket, which they used to create a makeshift windbreak, improving their small haven. "You're full of surprises today," Mason remarked as Eleanor efficiently organized their improvised camp. A ghost of a smile crossed her weathered face. "You don't get to my age without learning to prepare for the worst." She hesitated, then added more softly, "especially in this line of work." As Mason began examining the calf more thoroughly, Eleanor pulled a satellite phone from her pack. "No cell service out here during storms, but this should work. I need to check on the other rangers." While Eleanor made her calls, Mason focused on the calf. Beyond the obvious injury to its trapped leg, he was increasingly concerned about the unusual lesions on its hide and the yellowish tint to its eyes. Drawing on his veterinary training, he recognized symptoms consistent with toxic exposure. "What have you been drinking, little one?" he murmured, gently palpating the calf's abdomen. The animal's trust in him was remarkable, allowing his examination with only occasional nervous shifts. Eleanor returned, her expression grave as she tucked the satellite phone away. Flash floods throughout the county. Roads washed out in 3 places. "We're on our own until at least tomorrow morning." "What about Luke?" Mason asked. "No word," Eleanor replied, "but he radioed in to dispatch before we lost contact." "He's alive, at least." Mason nodded, relieved despite his suspicions about the young ranger. He turned his attention back to the calf. "Eleanor, these symptoms, I've seen something similar before. During my residency, we treated cattle affected by mine tailings that had contaminated a water source." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Sterling swears their extraction process is environmentally sound. They fought every attempt at independent testing." "Well, this calf is showing classic signs of heavy metal poisoning," Mason said grimly. "And if it's affecting the wildlife, it could be affecting groundwater throughout the county," Eleanor finished, the implications hanging heavy between them. The rain continued unabated, water streaming from the limestone overhang like a curtain, isolating their small shelter from the world beyond. In this enforced pause, Mason found himself studying Eleanor more carefully. Despite her tough exterior, he could see exhaustion etched in the lines of her face and something else, a pallor that spoke of more than just the stress of their current situation. "Eleanor," he began carefully, "how long have you been sick?" She stiffened slightly, then sighed, resignation replacing surprise. "Should have known I couldn't hide it from a doctor, even a veterinarian." She settled herself more comfortably against the rock wall. "Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed 6 months ago." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. 6 months. "Eleanor, why didn't you tell me?" "There are treatments." "At my age? With stage 4? She shook her head. "I've made my peace with it, Mason. But I'm not going without a fight. Just not the kind fought in hospitals." "What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes took on a fierce gleam. "Sterling Mining. For 30 years, I've watched them tear up this country, pollute its water, buy its officials. Your father was the only one who stood against them openly, and look what it cost him." She gestured toward the calf. "These cattle, his bloodline, they're evidence, Mason. Evidence that the land Sterling claimed has been poisoned." Mason processed this revelation. "That's why you've been tracking the herd." She nodded. "The Blackwood Brahmins were always hardier than most cattle. If they're showing symptoms of poisoning, then any environmental assessment would have to acknowledge the contamination," Mason concluded. "That's why you were so insistent about documenting everything today." "Sterling's been pushing for an expansion permit," Eleanor explained. "Another 5,000 acres, including most of what's left of the conservation area. The county commissioners vote next week." She fixed Mason with an intense gaze. "I need your help, Mason. Your veterinary expertise, your family name, and your sister." "Sarah?" Mason laughed bitterly. "She's Sterling's attack dog now. You saw her today." "I saw a Blackwood," Eleanor countered. "Whatever else she's become, Sarah carries your father's blood. And deep down, she knows what Sterling did to your family." Mason was skeptical, but before he could respond, the calf struggled to its feet, letting out a plaintive call that echoed across the storm-swept landscape. To their astonishment, an answering low came from somewhere beyond their shelter. "That's impossible," Mason breathed, peering through the rain curtain. "The herd couldn't have made it up here through the flood." Yet there they were, dark shapes materializing through the downpour. The Brahmin herd, led by the massive bull, had somehow navigated the treacherous terrain to reach higher ground, and now, with uncanny precision, they had located their missing calf. Mason and Eleanor froze as the lead bull approached their shelter, its massive head lowered, steam rising from its rain-soaked hide. The animal's eyes, surprisingly intelligent, fixed on Mason with unmistakable intent. "Don't move," Mason whispered to Eleanor, though she hardly needed the warning. The bull snorted, pawing the muddy ground just yards from their shelter. Behind it, several cows had gathered, including one that continued calling to the calf. The mother, Mason realized. The calf responded eagerly, attempting to move toward its mother despite its injured leg. Mason instinctively placed a restraining hand on the animal, concerned about its condition. What happened next defied everything Mason thought he knew about cattle behavior. Instead of charging or retreating, the bull took another step forward, then deliberately lowered itself to the ground, dropping to its knees in the mud before their shelter. The posture was neither threatening nor submissive. It was almost expectant. "I've never seen anything like this," Mason murmured, amazed. "It's like he's waiting," Eleanor finished. "He's waiting for you to return the calf." The mother cow called again, a plaintive sound that tugged at something deep in Mason's chest. He looked down at the calf, which was straining toward its family despite its weakness. "She needs medical attention," Mason said, the veterinarian in him reluctant to release his patient. "That leg needs proper treatment, and the toxicity symptoms." "Mason," Eleanor said gently, "they're her family. Sometimes that's the best medicine." After a moment's hesitation, Mason carefully helped the calf to its feet. "Go on," he encouraged softly, removing his supporting hands. "Your mama's waiting." With remarkable determination, the calf hobbled forward, crossing the short distance to where its mother waited. The reunion was touching in its simplicity. The mother immediately began licking her calf, checking it over with the thoroughness only a parent could manage. The bull remained in its unusual posture, watching the proceedings with what Mason could only describe as satisfaction. Only when the calf was securely reunited with its mother did the massive animal rise to its feet, shaking off the rain in a spray of droplets. For a breathless moment, the bull's gaze locked with Mason's. There was recognition there, impossible as it seemed, as if the animal somehow knew Mason was connected to the land and the legacy it represented. Then, with a rumbling bellow that vibrated through the air despite the storm's noise, the bull turned and led its herd away, moving deeper into the conservation lands. The calf, supported by its mother, followed, its distinctive triangular ear notch visible until the herd disappeared into the rain. "Well, I'll be damned," Eleanor whispered, awe evident in her voice. Joseph always said Brahmins were smarter than people gave them credit for. The unusual encounter left Mason strangely moved. For years, he'd distanced himself from his ranching heritage, focusing instead on his veterinary calling. Yet, watching the Blackwood Brahmins, his father's living legacy, stirred something primal within him. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "tell me everything you know about Sterling's expansion plans." She studied him for a moment, recognizing the shift in his demeanor. "It started about a year ago. Their geologists found something in the deep core samples, some rare earth mineral used in medical technology. Suddenly, the land they'd been content to leave alone became their top priority. And the conservation area stands in their way," Mason concluded. Eleanor nodded. "Along with about a dozen small properties owned by holdouts who've refused to sell." She hesitated, then added, "Including what's left of your mother's family land, that 40 acres she inherited from her parents." Mason had almost forgotten about that small parcel, a piece of land too rocky for decent grazing, tucked away in a remote corner of the county. His mother had left it to him in her will, but he'd paid it little attention over the years. Why would Sterling want that scrub land, he wondered aloud. "Location," Eleanor replied. "It sits at a crucial junction point for their planned expansion. Without it, they'd have to reroute their entire operation, costing millions." As they talked, Eleanor pulled a weathered leather satchel from her pack. "I've been gathering evidence for months," she explained, extracting a folder of documents protected in waterproof plastic. Water samples, soil tests from university researchers, wildlife health assessments, all pointing to contamination from Sterling's current operation. Mason leafed through the papers, his professional eye catching the significance of the test results. "This is damning, Eleanor. Why hasn't the county acted on it?" "Sterling has 3 of the 5 county commissioners in his pocket," she replied bitterly. "The EPA investigation keeps getting delayed through legal maneuvers, but with your veterinary expertise confirming the symptoms in wildlife and especially in your father's cattle." She left the implication hanging. Outside their shelter, the storm's intensity had begun to wane slightly, the torrential downpour easing to a steady rain. The worst of the flash flooding had passed, but the ravines would remain dangerous for hours yet. As Mason continued examining Eleanor's documentation, something caught his eye, a familiar name on one of the older deeds. "This says Joseph Blackwood transferred 20 acres to you in 2005, just before the foreclosure." Eleanor's expression softened with old memories. "Your father was preparing for the worst. He knew Sterling would eventually come after the conservation area, too." "But why you?" Mason pressed, sensing there was more to the story. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the rain beyond their shelter. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of long-held secrets. "Your father and I had a complicated history, Mason. We were close, long before he met your mother." She smiled faintly at some private memory. "We were young, idealistic, both determined to protect this land in our own ways. Joseph through ranching, me through conservation." Mason absorbed this revelation, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed falling into place. The way Eleanor had always been present in his childhood, her special relationship with his father, the trust Joseph had placed in her even at the end. "When Sterling began his campaign against your father," Eleanor continued, "Joseph transferred that land to me to keep it safe. It was his insurance policy, a way to ensure that at least some piece of the Blackwood legacy would survive. She hesitated, then reached into the satchel again, extracting a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "He left this with me, too. Said I should give it to you if things ever reached a breaking point with Sterling." She handed it to Mason. "I think that time has come." Mason took the envelope with a strange sense of reverence. His father's handwriting marked the front simply, "For Mason, when the time is right." As he broke the seal, the satellite phone suddenly chirped with an incoming call. Eleanor answered quickly, her expression shifting from concern to shock as she listened. "When?" she demanded. "Oh, are you sure?" Another pause. "No, we're safe for now. We'll make our way back once the water recedes." She ended the call, her face ashen. "What is it?" Mason asked, setting aside the unopened letter. "Luke Davidson," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "He's dead, Mason." They found his body washed up against the county bridge. The news hit Mason like a physical blow. Despite his suspicions about Luke's loyalties, he had worked alongside the young ranger for over a year. The realization that their last interaction had been colored by distrust only deepened the guilt now washing over him. "How?" he managed to ask. "They think he was trying to cross one of the flooded creeks," Eleanor replied. "His phone was still in his hand when they found him." Mason closed his eyes briefly, memories of Luke's eagerness and dedication, however compromised by outside influences, flooding back. He was making a call when the bull charged. "I saw him." "To Sterling, most likely," Eleanor said quietly. "But that doesn't mean he deserved this." The rain continued falling outside their shelter, gentler now but persistent, as if the land itself were mourning. In the distance, thunder rumbled, moving away but still present, like a threat receding but not forgotten. Mason returned to his father's letter, carefully unfolding the brittle paper. As he read the faded words, his expression changed from curiosity to disbelief, then to something harder to define, a mixture of anger, vindication, and profound sadness. "My God," he whispered finally, looking up at Eleanor with new understanding. "Dad knew. He knew all along what Sterling was really after." Eleanor nodded slowly. "The mineral deposits. They were discovered during a geological survey in the 1970s, but your grandfather buried the report, believing the land was more valuable as ranch than mine." "Not just that," Mason said, his voice tight with emotion. "Sterling falsified the boundary surveys before the foreclosure. He moved markers, altered maps. The eastern section of our ranch, including this entire drainage system, was never legally transferred to Sterling Mining." He held up the letter. "Dad documented everything, had copies of the original surveys notarized and stored with his attorney in Austin." The implications were staggering. If Joseph's claims could be verified, Sterling's entire mining operation was partially situated on land they didn't legally own. Years of extraction, millions in profit, all potentially fraudulent. "That's why Dad transferred that 20 acres to you," Mason realized. It wasn't just sentiment, it was strategy. He was protecting a crucial piece of evidence. Eleanor smiled, a hint of the young fighter she must have been showing through. Joseph always played the long game. He knew someday someone would stand up to Sterling. He just didn't live to see it. As the storm's fury gradually diminished outside, Mason and Eleanor began planning their next moves. The evidence they now possessed, the contamination data, the boundary disputes, the Blackwood cattle showing signs of poisoning, formed a powerful case against Sterling Mining's expansion. "Sarah needs to see this," Mason said finally. "Whatever side she's chosen, she deserves to know the truth about what happened to our family." Eleanor nodded agreement. "The county commissioners meet in 3 days to vote on Sterling's permit application. If we're going to stop this, that's our deadline." As daylight began to fade, They prepared to spend the night in their improvised shelter. The satellite phone had brought news that rescue teams wouldn't be able to reach their location until morning at the earliest. Mason found himself returning to thoughts of the bull herd, his father's living legacy, surviving against all odds in the margins between wilderness and development. Like the Blackwood family itself, they had endured by adapting, by finding refuge in overlooked corners, by passing down their strength to each new generation. "We should get some rest," Eleanor suggested, arranging her pack as a makeshift pillow. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As Eleanor drifted into sleep, Mason remained awake, his father's letter clasped in his hands, his mind racing with revelations and possibilities. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and through the gap in their limestone shelter, he could see stars beginning to emerge in the clearing sky. Somewhere out there, the Blackwood Brahmins were bedded down for the night, the rescued calf safe among its family. And somewhere, too, was Sarah, perhaps already hearing about Luke's death, about the confrontation at the ravine, about the boundary marker that shouldn't have existed. Tomorrow would bring its own storms, legal battles, family confrontations, and the weight of decisions that would shape the future of Stone Creek County. But for now, in this moment of temporary peace, Mason felt closer to his father than he had in years, guided by words written long ago in anticipation of this very fight. "I'll finish what you started, Dad," he whispered to the night. "I promise." Dawn broke over Stone Creek County with the crystalline clarity that often follows violent storms. The air was washed clean, the limestone outcroppings gleaming in the early light, and birdsong had returned to the rain-soaked landscape. Mason emerged from their makeshift shelter, muscles stiff from the night spent on hard ground, to find the world transformed by the flood's passage. Where yesterday dry ravines had cut through the land, now temporary streams flowed vigorously. The storm had scoured the earth, revealing bones of stone long buried under soil and scrub. Nature's power had reasserted itself over human presumptions of control, a reminder Mason found oddly comforting as he surveyed the changed terrain. Eleanor joined him, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing constant pain. Though she'd never complained, Mason had heard her muffled gasps throughout the night as she shifted position, seeking relief that never fully came. "Search and rescue should reach us within a couple hours," she said, checking the satellite phone. "They've cleared the main roads, but the backcountry is still a mess." Mason nodded, his attention caught by movement on a distant ridge. The Brahmin herd was visible in the early light, their silver-gray coats gleaming as they grazed on the storm-freshened grass. With his father's letter tucked securely in his pocket, their presence felt like a benediction, a living testament to Joseph Blackwood's foresight and determination. "How are we going to play this, Eleanor?" Mason asked, turning back to his companion. "Sterling won't just roll over because of some old boundary disputes and water quality reports." Eleanor's eyes narrowed against the brightening sky. "I've been fighting men like Victor Sterling for 40 years, Mason. They all have the same weakness. They believe their money makes them untouchable." She patted the weatherproof satchel containing their evidence. "But even in Texas, the law still matters, especially when the public is watching." They used the satellite phone to arrange a rendezvous point with the search team, then gathered their few belongings and began the careful trek toward higher ground. The landscape was treacherous, with seemingly solid ground occasionally giving way to reveal flood-carved chasms beneath. As they walked, Mason's thoughts turned to Luke Davidson. The young ranger had been an enigma, clearly reporting to Sterling, yet genuinely dedicated to his conservation work. Now he was gone, another casualty in a conflict that had claimed too many lives already. "Luke didn't deserve to die," Mason said aloud, negotiating a particularly steep section of trail. "Whatever deals he made with Sterling—" Eleanor paused to catch her breath before responding. Few people are all good or all bad, Mason. Luke was supporting his mother and younger siblings on a ranger's salary. Sterling probably offered him enough money to put his sister through college. That doesn't excuse betraying everything the Conservation Service stands for, Mason countered, though his tone lacked conviction. No, Eleanor agreed, but it explains it. Understanding isn't the same as condoning. She fixed Mason with a pointed look. Something to remember when you see Sarah. The mention of his sister brought a fresh wave of complicated emotions. The Sarah he'd grown up with, fiercely intelligent, deeply attached to the ranch, their father's unflinching ally in the early fights against Sterling, seemed irreconcilable with the corporate lawyer who'd confronted them yesterday. I don't know if Sarah can be reached anymore, Mason admitted. She's built her whole identity around Sterling mining now. Eleanor's reply was interrupted by the distant sound of a helicopter. They looked up to see a search and rescue chopper approaching from the east, its distinctive orange and white markings identifying it as County Emergency Services rather than Sterling Mining Security. Within 20 minutes they were airborne, the flood-ravaged landscape spread beneath them like a relief map. From this height, the extent of the storm's impact became clear. Roads washed out, low-lying ranches isolated by newly formed lakes, livestock huddled on islands of high ground. "We need to go to the county office first," Eleanor instructed the pilot. "There are documents there we need to secure before Sterling's people can interfere." Mason used the flight to study his father's letter more carefully. Beyond the boundary disputes and the mineral rights claims, Joseph had included something else, a confession of sorts, written in the knowledge that his son might one day need to understand the full story. "I've never told you the real reason for my feud with Victor Sterling," Joseph had written. "It wasn't just about land or minerals. Victor, Eleanor, and I grew up together in Stone Creek. The three of us were inseparable as teenagers until Victor and I both fell in love with Eleanor." Mason glanced at Eleanor, now dozing in her seat, exhaustion finally claiming her. Had she known his father would reveal this long-buried history? The letter continued. "Eleanor chose me, and Victor never forgave either of us. He left town for 20 years, making his fortune in oil and mining. When he returned to Stone Creek in the 90s, buying up struggling ranches and launching Sterling Mining, I knew he hadn't forgotten. This fight was never just business for Victor. It was personal." The helicopter banked sharply, beginning its descent toward the county administration building in Stone Creek's modest downtown. Mason folded the letter carefully. His understanding of the conflict and the players involved fundamentally altered. They touched down in the parking lot, which had been partially converted to an emergency operations center following the flood. Emergency vehicles, their lights flashing, surrounded the building, and county workers moved with the focused urgency of crisis response. As they disembarked, a familiar figure approached across the rain-washed asphalt. Sheriff Tom Whitaker had been a contemporary of Mason's father, one of the few local officials who had stood with Joseph Blackwood against Sterling's influence. "Eleanor Chambers," the sheriff greeted them, his weathered face creased with concern. "When they said you were stranded out in that storm, I feared the worst." He nodded respectfully to Mason. "Dr. Blackwood." The use of his professional title, long abandoned in Stone Creek, caught Mason by surprise. The sheriff noted his reaction with a slight smile. "Once a doctor, always a doctor," Whitaker said. "At least in my book." Eleanor cut to the heart of the matter with characteristic directness. "Tom, we need access to the county survey archives and the original land grant records, and we need to keep it quiet." The sheriff's expression grew serious. "That might be difficult. Sterling's got people all over the building today, claiming they're assessing flood damage to their properties but watching every move we make. Victor knows we found something," Mason concluded. "He's trying to control the narrative." Sheriff Whitaker lowered his voice. "There's more. Emergency meeting of the county commissioners this afternoon. Sterling's pushing to move up the vote on their expansion permit, claiming the flood damage makes it urgent to begin operations in the new area. Eleanor's face hardened with determination. He's trying to bulldoze this through while everyone's distracted by the disaster. She glanced at Mason. We need those records, Tom, and we need Sarah Blackwood. Your sister's already here, the sheriff replied, nodding toward the building. Sterling Mining has set up a flood relief station in the lobby. Good PR and perfect cover for keeping an eye on county operations. Mason felt a surge of both anticipation and dread at the prospect of confronting Sarah again, this time armed with their father's revelations. But before they could move toward the building, a black SUV with Sterling Mining's logo pulled into the parking lot, stopping directly in their path. Victor Sterling himself emerged from the back seat, impeccably dressed despite the crisis atmosphere, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his movements spry despite his 78 years. He approached with the confident smile of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. "Eleanor," he greeted, his voice carrying the refined accent of expensive education layered over Texas roots. "I'm relieved to see you safe. When we heard about your ranger's tragic accident, we feared the worst for all of you." His gaze shifted to Mason, the smile never reaching his eyes. "And Mason Blackwood, following in your father's footsteps after all, tilting at windmills and chasing lost causes." Mason felt a surge of anger at Sterling's casual dismissal of his father's struggles, but Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Victor," she acknowledged coolly, "I'm surprised to see you taking such a personal interest in flood response. Usually you leave the dirty work to your employees." Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Stone Creek is my home too, Eleanor. I care deeply about its recovery." He gestured toward the county building. "In fact, I've just pledged $5 million for flood relief and infrastructure repairs." "How generous," Eleanor replied, her tone making it clear she recognized the strategy. "Especially with the expansion permit vote pending." Sterling's facade of geniality slipped slightly. "Progress can't wait for perfect conditions, Eleanor. This county needs the jobs and tax revenue now more than ever." He turned to Mason. "I understand you encountered some of my security personnel yesterday. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding about property boundaries." The calculated understatement of the confrontation made Mason's blood boil, but he maintained his composure. "No misunderstanding at all, Mr. Sterling. In fact, I think we're finally getting clarity about exactly where those boundaries lie." A flash of something, concern, perhaps even fear, crossed Sterling's face before his practiced smile returned. "Well, boundary disputes are for surveyors and lawyers to sort out. Speaking of which, I believe you've reconnected with your sister. Sarah has become invaluable to our operation." The mention of Sarah was clearly meant to provoke, but Mason refused to take the bait. "Family is complicated, Mr. Sterling. Something I believe you understand well." The subtle reference to the relationship between Sterling, Eleanor, and Joseph Blackwood landed with precision. Sterling's smile vanished entirely, his gaze hardening as he looked between Mason and Eleanor. "I see Joseph left more than just a failed ranch to his son," Sterling said coldly. "He always did have a talent for poisoning minds against me." Eleanor stepped forward, her diminutive stature belying the force of her presence. "The only poisoning happening in Stone Creek County is in the groundwater near your mining operation, Victor. Something the EPA will be very interested to learn about." Sterling's expression remained impassive, but Mason noticed his hand tighten on his walking stick. "Accusations require evidence, Eleanor. Evidence that stands up to scientific and legal scrutiny, not the desperate theories of aging conservationists." "We have the evidence," Mason stated flatly, "including blood work from wildlife showing heavy metal contamination consistent with your extraction process." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Sterling's composed features. If you had actionable evidence, you would have presented it already. We're presenting it today, Eleanor countered, at the commissioners' meeting, along with proof that portions of your current operation are situated on illegally acquired land. Sterling's mask of civility dropped completely. Be careful, Eleanor. You're playing a dangerous game with forces you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Victor, she replied, unflinching. I've understood since we were 18, and you couldn't accept that some things aren't for sale. The personal barb struck home. Sterling's face flushed with anger, years of carefully cultivated self-control momentarily shattered. This county will have its mine, Eleanor, with or without your blessing. The world needs what lies beneath this land, needs it for medicines, for technology that saves lives. Lives like your son's? Mason asked quietly, the pieces suddenly connecting in his mind. Is that what this is really about, Mr. Sterling? Finding a cure too late? The mention of Sterling's son, who had died of a rare form of cancer years earlier, visibly shook the older man. For a moment, raw grief replaced calculation in his eyes, offering a glimpse of the human being beneath the corporate persona. You know nothing about my son, Sterling said, his voice barely controlled. Nothing about what drives me. I know what it's like to lose family, Mason replied, thinking of his father. But destroying other families' land, poisoning their water, that won't bring him back. Sterling seemed about to respond when the county building's doors opened and Sarah Blackwood emerged. She took in the tableau before her. Her brother and Eleanor squared off against her employer, and her professional mask briefly slipped, revealing conflicted loyalties. "Mr. Sterling?" she called, approaching with forced confidence. "The commissioners are asking for you. They're ready to begin the emergency session." Sterling composed himself with visible effort, the vulnerable moment passing as quickly as it had appeared. "We'll continue this discussion inside," he said, turning away from Mason and Eleanor. "Sarah, your brother has some theories he'd like to share. Perhaps you can help him understand the legal realities before he embarrasses himself publicly." As Sterling walked away, Sarah remained, awkwardly caught between following her boss and acknowledging her brother. The professional polish that had been so evident yesterday was slightly diminished now, her hair less perfectly arranged, dark circles visible beneath her eyes. "Luke Davidson is dead," Mason said without preamble. "Drowned trying to cross a flooded creek, probably rushing to report to Sterling about what we found." Sarah flinched. "I heard. It's tragic. Did you also hear that we found cattle with the Blackwood brand, Dad's bloodline surviving all these years on land that Sterling claimed was worthless?" Mason pressed. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, a brief spark of the sister who had once loved their father's prize bulls, who had helped deliver calves and name them, who had cried when the herd was loaded for auction. "Mason, whatever you think you've discovered, it can't change what's happening today," she said, her voice professional but strained. "The expansion permit has the votes." "The county needs Sterling mining, especially after this flood. Even if the operation is poisoning the groundwater, even if Sterling acquired the land illegally," Eleanor interjected. Sarah's gaze snapped to Eleanor, surprise and suspicion mingling in her expression. "What are you talking about?" Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew their father's letter. "Dad left this for me. You should read it before you go back in there and help Sterling destroy what's left of our family's legacy." Sarah stared at the letter, hesitation evident in her posture. For a moment Mason glimpsed the sister he'd grown up with, the brilliant, principled young woman who had once been their father's fiercest defender. "There isn't time," she said finally, though her eyes remained fixed on the envelope. "The meeting starts in 10 minutes. "Make time," Mason insisted, holding out the letter. "Dad knew this day would come. He prepared for it." The least you can do is hear what he had to say. A tense silence stretched between them, broken finally by Eleanor's quiet intervention. "Sarah, I've known you since you were born. Whatever differences you've had with your brother, with your father's memory, you're still a Blackwood, still Joseph's daughter." She gestured toward the county building where Sterling had disappeared. "Before you choose sides today, make sure you know the whole story." Something in Eleanor's words reached Sarah. With a quick glance toward the building to ensure no one was watching, she took the letter from Mason's hand and tucked it into her jacket. 10 minutes, she said tersely. "That's all I can give you before the meeting." As Sarah walked away, Sheriff Whitaker approached from where he'd been tactfully maintaining distance during the confrontation. "I can get you into the records room through the basement," he offered. "But you'll need to move fast." "Sterling's already got the commissioners talking about emergency powers and expedited permitting." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Lead the way, Tom. Mason and I have some maps to verify before this meeting begins." As they followed the sheriff toward a side entrance, Mason caught Eleanor studying him with an approving expression. "What?" he asked. "You're more like your father than you realize," she replied simply. "He would have been proud of how you stood up to Sterling just now." The compliment warmed Mason, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Dad would have stopped Sterling years ago. "I'm just playing catch-up." Eleanor shook her head. "Joseph laid the groundwork, kept the evidence safe, maintained the bloodline, but he knew the final battle would fall to you." Her expression softened with old memories. "He always said you had a clearer sense of justice than he did, less compromised by the past." They reached a service door where the sheriff produced a key. "County records are on the lower level," he explained. "Original land grants, survey maps, property transfers, all cataloged by year. What exactly are we looking for?" "The original Blackwood Ranch boundaries from the 1950s, Eleanor replied, "and any surveyor's reports filed just before Sterling Mining acquired the property in 2005. The sheriff led them through utilitarian hallways, the building's basement largely untouched by the modernization evident on the upper floors. The records room itself was a testament to small county budget constraints, metal shelving laden with cardboard boxes, older documents still stored in leather-bound volumes rather than digitized. "I'll keep watch," Sheriff Whitaker offered, positioning himself near the door. "You've got about 20 minutes before someone notices you're down here." Eleanor moved through the room with the familiarity of someone who had spent decades navigating county bureaucracy, quickly locating the section containing land records for the eastern part of the county. Mason followed her lead, pulling down boxes labeled with years corresponding to Sterling's acquisition of the Blackwood property. "Here," Eleanor said triumphantly, extracting a large folded map from a leather portfolio. "The original survey of the Blackwood grant, certified 1952 when your grandfather formalized the ranch boundaries." She carefully unfolded it on a reading table, revealing a hand-drawn survey map with meticulous notations of landmarks, elevation changes, and boundary markers. Mason immediately recognized the Ravine system where they'd found the trapped calf. "According to this, that entire eastern section, including the ravine where we found the calf, was Blackwood land," Mason confirmed, tracing the boundary line with his finger. Eleanor nodded, already pulling additional documents from another box. "Now we need to compare it with the survey Sterling submitted during the foreclosure process." Side by side, the discrepancy was unmistakable. The survey map, filed with Sterling's acquisition, showed the eastern boundary nearly half a mile west of its original position, conveniently placing the mineral-rich ravine system within Sterling Mining's claim. "He altered the boundaries," Mason said, anger rising as he saw the extent of the fraud. "Moved the line just enough to capture the deposits Dad always refused to exploit." Eleanor was examining the Sterling survey more closely. "Look at the surveyor's signature," she said, pointing to the certification stamp. "Martin Wells." He was Sterling's personal surveyor brought in from Houston specifically for this job. "Can we prove the alteration?" Mason asked, aware that historical boundary disputes could be notoriously difficult to resolve. Eleanor smiled thinly. "Your father anticipated that question." She extracted a final document from her satchel, a notarized statement from 2005, accompanied by photographs of the original boundary markers and their GPS coordinates. Joseph documented every marker before Sterling's people could remove them, and based on what you found yesterday, at least some of those markers are still in place. Mason felt a surge of vindication. His father hadn't been the defeated man Sterling had portrayed. He'd been playing a longer game, methodically documenting the fraud for future justice. "This is enough to challenge Sterling's claim to that section," Mason said, hope building for the first time. "Enough to force a proper environmental assessment of the affected area. And enough to pause any expansion permit until ownership of the current operation is legally resolved," Eleanor added, carefully photographing both surveys with her phone. "Sterling has built his empire on quicksand." The door opened abruptly and Sheriff Whitaker stepped back into the room, his expression urgent. "Time's up. Sterling's people are asking questions about your whereabouts. The meeting starts in 5 minutes." They quickly gathered the most crucial documents, returning the rest to their boxes. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor suddenly staggered, one hand grasping the edge of the table for support, the other pressed against her side. "Eleanor?" Mason moved to her immediately, medical training taking over as he noted her pallor and shallow breathing. "Just need a minute," she gasped, fumbling in her pocket for a pill bottle. Her hand shook as she tried to open it. Mason gently took the bottle, opened it, and placed a tablet in her palm. "How long have the pain attacks been this severe?" Eleanor swallowed the medication dry, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "Getting worse this past month. Doctor wanted me in hospice weeks ago." She straightened with visible effort. "But I'm not dying before I see Sterling answer for what he's done." Sheriff Whitaker watched with concern. "Eleanor, maybe you should sit this one out. Let Mason present the evidence." She fixed the sheriff with a glare that belied her physical frailty. "I've been fighting this battle for 30 years, Tom. I'll be damned if I miss the final round." She turned to Mason. "But I might need your arm for support, just until this medication kicks in." Mason offered his arm without hesitation, recognizing that Eleanor's determination was not mere stubbornness, but the culmination of a life's purpose. Together, they made their way toward the county commission chambers, where decades of conflict would finally reach its resolution. As they approached the meeting room, they could hear raised voices inside, the emergency session already underway. Through the door's window, Mason caught sight of Sterling at the podium, gesturing emphatically as he addressed the commissioners. Sarah sat at a table nearby, her posture rigid, her father's letter open before her. "Ready?" Mason asked, looking down at Eleanor. She nodded, her eyes clear and determined despite the pain etched in her features. "Stone Creek has waited long enough for justice. Let's not keep them waiting any longer." With that, they pushed open the door and stepped into the chamber, carrying the truth that would shake Stone Creek County to its foundations. The county commission chambers fell silent as Mason and Eleanor entered. 5 commissioners sat behind the elevated dais at the front of the room, their expressions ranging from annoyance at the interruption to barely concealed relief at the delay. Victor Sterling halted mid-sentence at the podium, his carefully crafted presentation disrupted by their arrival. Mason felt the weight of every gaze as he guided Eleanor toward the public testimony area. The room was packed despite the emergency nature of the meeting, ranchers in mud-stained boots sitting alongside Sterling mining employees in company polos, concerned citizens next to county officials. Crisis had a way of bringing Stone Creek's divisions into sharp relief. Sarah's eyes locked with Mason's across the room. Their father's letter lay open on the table before her, and Mason could see that her hands were trembling slightly. Whatever she had read in those pages had shaken her professional composure. She looked away first, shuffling papers as if seeking distraction from uncomfortable truths. "Mr. Sterling, please continue," Chairman Warren Atkins prompted from the center of the dais. At 72, Atkins had presided over the commission for 2 decades, his political survival dependent on balancing the county's competing interests, or more recently, on acquiescing to Sterling's influence while maintaining a veneer of independence. Sterling cleared his throat, recovering his poise with practiced ease. "As I was saying, Commissioners, the damage from yesterday's flooding makes our expansion proposal not just beneficial, but essential to Stone Creek's recovery. Our economists project the creation of 200 new jobs in the first year alone, with an economic impact of—" "Excuse me, Chairman Atkins," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying surprising strength despite her physical frailty. "We request time to present critical information relevant to Sterling Mining's application, information that has only come to light in the past 24 hours. Sterling's jaw tightened visibly. "Chairman, this meeting was called specifically to address emergency measures following the flood. Ms. Chambers is attempting to hijack the agenda with her usual environmental obstructionism." Atkins looked uncomfortable, caught between procedural correctness and his usual deference to Sterling. "Ms. Chambers, while we respect your long service to the county, this is indeed an emergency session with a limited agenda." Sheriff Whitaker stepped forward from where he had followed Mason and Eleanor into the room. "Chairman, as the county's chief law enforcement officer, I'm requesting that Ms. Chambers and Dr. Blackwood be permitted to speak. Their information relates directly to public safety concerns arising from the flood. The strategic invocation of public safety, a topic no elected official could easily dismiss, created the opening they needed." After a brief consultation with the other commissioners, Atkins reluctantly nodded. "5 minutes, Miss Chambers, not a second more." Eleanor moved to the podium with Mason's support, placing their documentary evidence carefully before her. "Commissioners, yesterday's flood did more than damage roads and isolate ranches. It exposed a pattern of environmental contamination and property rights violations that directly impacts your decision today." She gestured to Mason, who stepped forward with the photographs they had taken of the sick Brahmin calf. "As a licensed veterinarian, I documented clear symptoms of heavy metal poisoning in wildlife living downstream from Sterling Mining's current operation. These symptoms include liver damage, neurological impairment, and reproductive failure." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Sterling stepped closer to the commissioners, speaking in a stage whisper audible to the entire room. "Dr. Blackwood surrendered his veterinary license years ago. His expert testimony wouldn't stand up in any court." "Actually," Sheriff Whitaker interjected, "Dr. Blackwood's license was temporarily suspended, not surrendered. According to state records, that suspension expired 3 years ago. His credentials are current and valid." Mason felt a shock of surprise. He had never pursued reinstatement after his suspension, assuming the professional censure was permanent. The sheriff gave him a slight nod as if to say, "Some of us never stopped believing in you." "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "yesterday's flooding exposed original boundary markers from the Blackwood Ranch that directly contradict the property lines Sterling Mining has claimed since 2005. She displayed the photographs of the boundary marker they had discovered, alongside the original survey maps. "Sterling Mining has been operating partially on land it does not legally own." The chamber erupted in shocked conversations. Commissioner Atkins banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. "These are serious allegations that would require proper legal review, Ms. Chambers. They cannot be adequately addressed in an emergency session." "Precisely our point, Chairman," Mason responded. "Any vote on Sterling's expansion permit should be postponed until these issues are thoroughly investigated." Victor Sterling abandoned all pretense of calm, striding to the podium. "This is a transparent delay tactic. Miss Bush Chambers is using her terminal illness to generate sympathy for baseless accusations." The cruel reference to Eleanor's condition sent another ripple of shocked murmurs through the chamber. Even commissioners known to be in Sterling's pocket looked uncomfortable with the personal attack. Eleanor, however, seemed almost relieved that her health status was now in the open. "Yes, I am dying, commissioners, which means I have nothing to lose by speaking truth to power. But the children of Stone Creek County have everything to lose if Sterling Mining continues to poison their water." She removed the final piece of evidence from her folder, laboratory results from water samples taken downstream from Sterling's operation. Independent testing confirms levels of arsenic, cadmium, and lead that exceed EPA standards by over 300%. Yesterday's flood spread these contaminants even further across the county. The commissioners leaned forward, examining the test results with growing concern. Public health risks carried political consequences that even Sterling's influence couldn't easily overcome. "These tests weren't conducted by certified environmental specialists," Sterling objected, though his usual confidence had begun to waver. "They're meaningless scare tactics from a woman whose judgment is compromised by medication and bitterness." Mason felt anger rising at Sterling's dismissive cruelty, but before he could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "The tests were conducted by the Environmental Sciences Department at Texas A&M, Sarah Blackwood stated, rising from her seat at the Sterling mining table. "I verified their certification this morning. They meet all federal standards for environmental testing." The room fell silent again, all eyes turning to Sarah's unexpected intervention. Victor Sterling stared at her with undisguised shock, his face flushing with anger. "Sarah, you haven't had time to properly validate these claims," he said, his tone a warning. Sarah straightened, meeting her employer's gaze with newfound resolve. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, I've had suspicions about the water quality issues for months. I requested internal testing last year and was told the results were proprietary and confidential. Now I understand why." She turned to address the commissioners directly. "As legal counsel for Sterling Mining, I cannot in good conscience allow the company to proceed without disclosing material facts. Our own internal studies from 2018, which were never made public, showed similar contamination patterns. I have copies here." She placed a flash drive on the commissioner's desk. "This contains all relevant internal documents regarding water quality and boundary surveys. I'm providing it voluntarily now, though I suspect it would eventually be subpoenaed." Sterling's composure shattered completely. "This is outrageous. You're violating attorney-client privilege, your employment contract, and your duty to this company." "My duty as an attorney is to the law first, Mr. Sterling," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the career-ending nature of her actions. "And my duty as a Blackwood is to the truth." Mason watched his sister with a mixture of pride and astonishment. The Sarah he'd known, principled, unflinching, loyal to what mattered, had finally re-emerged from behind the corporate facade. Eleanor swayed slightly at the podium, the emotional intensity of the moment taxing her already limited strength. Mason moved closer, offering support as she delivered her closing argument. "Commissioners, we're not asking you to shut down Sterling Mining today. We're simply requesting that you postpone the expansion permit vote until proper environmental impact studies can be conducted and the boundary disputes resolved." She paused, gathering her remaining energy. Stone Creek deserves to know what it's trading away before it's too late. Commissioner Atkins conferred briefly with his colleagues before addressing the chamber. "In light of these serious allegations and the new evidence presented, this commission will postpone the vote on Sterling Mining's expansion permit pending further investigation." He gavelled over Sterling's attempted objection. "This meeting is adjourned until next Monday at 9 a.m. at which time we will reconvene to establish an investigative framework." The chamber erupted again, this time with the excited conversations of citizens processing the dramatic turn of events. Victor Sterling stormed toward Sarah, his face contorted with rage. "You've destroyed your career," he hissed. "No law firm in Texas will touch you after this." Sarah stood her ground. "Maybe, but I can look at myself in the mirror tomorrow." She gathered her belongings with deliberate calm. "Consider this my resignation, effective immediately." As Sterling's security team hustled him toward a side exit, Eleanor finally gave in to the exhaustion she'd been fighting. Her knees buckled, and Mason caught her before she could fall, easing her into a nearby chair. "Someone call an ambulance!" he shouted, medical training taking over as he checked her pulse, rapid and thready, her skin clammy to the touch. Sarah rushed to their side, all professional detachment abandoned in the face of Eleanor's collapse. "What can I do?" she asked Mason, genuine concern replacing the corporate mask she'd worn for so long. "My satchel," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the car. Make sure it's safe." Sheriff Whitaker knelt beside them. "Ambulance is 3 minutes out." They were already staged nearby for the meeting. Mason held Eleanor's hand, recognizing the signs of serious medical distress. "Hang on, Eleanor. Just a little longer." Her eyes, clouded with pain but still sharp with awareness, fixed on his. "Joseph's letter," she managed. "Did you read all of it?" Mason nodded, though in truth he'd only skimmed the final pages in their rush to reach the meeting. "I did. About you and Dad and Sterling. I understand now." A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's pale lips. "Not everything. The last page." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll read it. All of it." "I promise," Mason assured her, concerned by the urgency in her fading voice. The paramedics arrived with efficient haste, gently moving Mason and Sarah aside as they began assessment and treatment. Mason watched helplessly as they placed an oxygen mask over Eleanor's face and established an IV line. "BP's dropping," one paramedic reported. "We need to move now." As they prepared to transfer Eleanor to a stretcher, she pulled the oxygen mask aside for one final instruction. "Mason, the herd? They're your responsibility now. Your father's legacy." Mason clasped her hand. "I'll protect them, Eleanor, I swear." She nodded once, seemingly satisfied, before allowing the paramedics to replace the mask. As they wheeled her rapidly toward the exit, Mason and Sarah followed, united in concern for the woman who had, in different ways, guided both their lives. Outside, storm clouds had gathered again, the brief morning clarity yielding to another approaching weather system. The air felt heavy with impending rain as the paramedics loaded Eleanor into the ambulance. "I'm riding with her," Mason told the lead paramedic, who nodded acknowledgement. Sarah stood awkwardly nearby, caught between worlds, no longer Sterling's lawyer, not yet fully reconciled with her brother. "Mason, I know," he cut her off, not unkindly. "We'll talk later. Right now, Eleanor needs me." Sarah nodded, understanding the priorities. "I'll secure her materials from the car and meet you at the hospital." As Mason climbed into the ambulance, Sheriff Whitaker caught his arm. "I just got word from my deputies," he said gravely. "Sterling's security team is already moving equipment toward the disputed boundary area. Looks like they're planning to extract as much as possible before any injunction can be filed." Mason absorbed this news with growing anger. Even now, with his fraud exposed and legal challenges mounting, Sterling was determined to strip the land of its resources by any means necessary. "Can you stop them?" Mason asked. The sheriff shook his head regretfully. "Not without a court order. Best I can do is monitor and document." "Do that," Mason instructed, "and call this number." He quickly wrote down the contact information for his former colleague at the State Veterinary Board. "Tell her we need emergency testing for water contamination affecting livestock. She can expedite an inspection order that would at least temporarily halt operations." As the ambulance doors closed, Mason caught a final glimpse of Sarah standing in the county building's shadow, her expression troubled but resolute. Whatever came next, the Blackwood siblings would face it with a clearer understanding of their shared legacy and the sacrifices required to honor it. The ambulance pulled away with lights flashing but no siren, a telling omission that sent a chill through Mason. In medical emergencies, silence often signaled the gravest situations, where speed mattered but the outcome was already determined. Inside the ambulance, Eleanor's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her breathing grew labored despite the oxygen, and the monitor showed her heart rate becoming increasingly erratic. The paramedics worked with focused intensity, administering medications and adjusting equipment. "Hang on, Eleanor," Mason urged, holding her hand as the paramedics established a second IV line. "We won. Sterling's exposed. Just a little longer." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. She pulled the oxygen mask aside again, despite the paramedic's gentle objection. "Not about winning," she whispered, each word an obvious struggle. "About protecting what matters." Her gaze held Mason's with surprising clarity. "Your father would be so proud of you today. Both of you." "Save your strength," Mason urged, emotion threatening to overwhelm his professional detachment. "We'll talk at the hospital." Eleanor shook her head slightly, seeming to gather her remaining energy for what she needed to say. "No time for that now. Listen to me, Mason. The conservation area. Your mother's 40 acres. They're connected. The deed is in my satchel. Joseph arranged it all before." A sudden spasm of pain cut off her words, her back arching as monitors began to alarm. And the paramedic gently but firmly moved Mason aside. "She's crashing. Give us room to work." Mason watched in helpless anguish as the medical team began resuscitation procedures. His physician's training told him what his heart refused to accept. Eleanor Chambers was slipping away, her body finally surrendering to the cancer that had been consuming her for months. Through the ambulance's rear windows, Mason could see storm clouds completely covering the sky now, the day's promising dawn swallowed by gathering darkness. It seemed a fitting parallel to this moment, victory in the commission chambers overshadowed by impending loss. The monitor's alarm changed tone, the erratic heartbeat pattern flattening into the most dreaded of medical signals. The paramedic met Mason's eyes briefly, a silent communication between professionals acknowledging the inevitable, before resuming CPR with renewed determination. Mason felt the ambulance accelerate, racing toward a hospital intervention that would almost certainly come too late. Eleanor's hand had grown cold in his grasp, her fingers no longer returning his desperate squeeze. In the sterile efficiency of the ambulance, surrounded by the mechanisms of modern medicine, Mason was struck by the ancient simplicity of what was happening, a life reaching its natural conclusion, a flame flickering out despite all human efforts to sustain it. As the paramedics continued their ultimately futile efforts, Mason leaned close to Eleanor's ear, wanting to ensure his words would reach her wherever her consciousness might now reside. "I'll protect them, Eleanor. The land, the herd, everything you and Dad fought for. I promise." For a moment, perhaps real, perhaps imagined, he felt the slightest pressure from her fingers. Then the monitor's tone changed again, signaling what the medical team already knew. Eleanor Chambers was gone. The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of procedural necessities: the paramedics' official time of death announcement, the redirection to the county morgue instead of the emergency room, the forms Mason signed with mechanical detachment. When the ambulance finally stopped, Mason emerged into the hospital parking lot to find Sarah waiting, Eleanor's satchel clutched protectively against her chest. One look at Mason's face told her everything. "She's gone," Sarah said. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. Mason nodded, the professional composure he'd maintained in the ambulance beginning to crumble now that his physician's responsibilities had ended. She held on just long enough to see Sterling exposed, to know her life's work wouldn't be in vain. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Mason had seen from his sister in years. "I should have helped her sooner." "Should have seen what was happening with the water contamination, with all of it." "You saw it when it mattered most," Mason assured her, surprising himself with the absence of recrimination in his voice. The day's events had left no energy for blame, only for the path forward. They stood in silence as hospital staff respectfully transferred Eleanor's body from the ambulance. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then with increasing intensity, as if the skies themselves were acknowledging the passing of Stone Creek's most dedicated guardian. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally, pulling her jacket tighter against the rain. Mason looked toward the western horizon, where the Blackwood land lay, where Sterling's equipment was even now racing to extract final profits before justice could intervene, where a herd of Brahmin cattle, living embodiments of their father's legacy, still roamed free. "Now we finish what Dad and Eleanor started," he replied, a new resolve hardening within him. "We protect what's ours." The rain continued falling, washing over the siblings as they stood united in grief and purpose for the first time in 15 years. Behind them, medical professionals tended to Eleanor's earthly remains. Before them lay a battle that would determine the future of not just their family legacy, but of Stone Creek County itself. And somewhere between past and future, in the moment of present decision, Mason Blackwood felt something shift within him, the reluctant heir finally accepting his inheritance, not just of land and cattle, but of responsibility and purpose. In that rain-soaked hospital parking lot, with his sister at his side and Eleanor's final mission entrusted to his care, Mason silently renewed the promise he had made to the dying woman to protect what mattered, whatever the cost. The rain fell harder, soaking through their clothes, but neither Blackwood moved to seek shelter. Some moments demanded witness, required the discomfort of elements as acknowledgement of their significance. This was such a moment, a passing of the torch, a changing of the guard, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Eleanor Chambers was gone. But the fight for Stone Creek continued. The rain fell in relentless sheets as Mason and Sarah made their way from the hospital morgue to the small conference room where Eleanor's body had been prepared for transfer to the funeral home. They moved in silence, both absorbed in private grief and calculations about what would come next. Mason clutched Eleanor's weathered satchel, which Sarah had handed to him without comment. Its contents, the documentation of decades of environmental vigilance, property deeds, and Joseph Blackwood's final instructions, now represented more than just evidence. They were Eleanor's last testament, a roadmap for the battles ahead. "We should read the rest of Dad's letter," Sarah said finally, breaking the heavy silence between them. "You said there was more, something Eleanor wanted you to see." Mason nodded, leading them to a quiet corner of the conference room. The hospital staff had respectfully given them privacy to make arrangements and gather themselves before facing the outside world again. Through the windows, they could see the storm intensifying, wind now driving the rain in diagonal sheets across the parking lot. Carefully, Mason extracted their father's letter from the satchel. The pages were worn at the edges from Eleanor's frequent handling over the years, the handwriting unmistakably Joseph Blackwood's. Bold strokes with occasional flourishes that reflected his confident, occasionally flamboyant personality. "I read the first part," Sarah said quietly. About Dad, Eleanor, and Sterling. Their history. She hesitated, then added, "It explains so much about why Sterling was so determined to destroy Dad. It wasn't just business. It was personal vendetta." Mason spread the remaining pages on the table between them. Eleanor said the last page was especially important. That I needed to understand everything. Together, they bent over the letter, reading Joseph Blackwood's final confessions by the sterile fluorescent light of the hospital conference room. "There's one more truth I've never shared," Joseph had written in a hand that seemed to tremble more than in the earlier pages. "A truth that Eleanor and I agreed to keep secret until after both our deaths. Mason, you've always known that I loved you as my son, raised you as my blood. But the full truth is that while you carry the Blackwood name, you carry Eleanor's blood." Mason stared at the words, their meaning initially refusing to register fully in his mind. Sarah gasped softly beside him. "Eleanor is your biological mother," Joseph continued. "We fell in love when we were barely more than children ourselves. When she discovered she was pregnant, we faced an impossible situation. Eleanor's parents would have disowned her, and my family's ranch was struggling through the drought of '82. We weren't ready to be parents, but neither could we bear to give you up entirely." The letter detailed the arrangement they had reached. Mason's mother, unable to have children of her own and newly married to Joseph, had agreed to raise the child as her own. The secret had been kept from everyone, including Mason and later Sarah, to protect all involved from the scandal that would have devastated careers and relationships in the small, judgmental community of Stone Creek. "Eleanor sacrificed her chance to raise you as her son so that you could have the stability of the Blackwood name and home. She channeled her love into protecting the land that would someday be your inheritance. Every battle she fought against Sterling Mining was, in her mind, a battle for your future." Mason set the letter down, his hands unsteady. The revelation reconstructed his entire understanding of his life, of Eleanor's constant presence, of the special bond she and his father had maintained even after his mother, the woman he had always known as his mother, had entered the picture. "Did you know?" he asked Sarah, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, eyes wide with shock. "No, never suspected." She reached for the letter again, rereading passages as if searching for some overlooked detail that might make the revelation less overwhelming. "This changes everything," Mason said quietly. "And nothing." He looked toward the door that led to where Eleanor's body lay. "She was always there, all my life, guiding, supporting, fighting for the land. She was a mother to me in every way that mattered, even if I didn't know it." Sarah's expression softened with compassion, a look Mason hadn't seen directed his way in years. "She loved you enough to let someone else raise you." "That's—" She trailed off, unable to find adequate words. "That sacrifice," Mason finished. "The kind Dad Joseph made, too, sharing the son he raised as his own with the woman he never stopped loving." The revelation cast Eleanor's final words in the ambulance in new light. Her insistence that Mason protect the herd, the land, the conservation area. These weren't just the concerns of a dedicated environmentalist passing the torch. They were a mother's final instructions to her son, entrusting him with the legacy she had spent a lifetime building for him. A knock at the door interrupted their processing of this life-altering information. Sheriff Whitaker entered, his uniform dark with rain, his expression grave. "Sorry to intrude," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "But we've got a situation developing that can't wait." Mason straightened, forcing himself to set aside personal revelations for the immediate crisis. "Sterling's people?" The sheriff nodded grimly. "Moving fast. They've got heavy equipment headed toward the disputed boundary area. Looks like they're planning to extract as much ore as possible before any court order can stop them." "Can you intervene?" Sarah asked, her legal mind already assessing options. "Not without a direct court order," Sheriff Whitaker replied, "which would take days to obtain through normal channels." Mason thought quickly, the pieces of Eleanor's strategy becoming clearer now that he understood her deeper motivations. "The conservation easement," he said, turning to the satchel and extracting a folder of legal documents. "Eleanor mentioned it in the ambulance. She said the conservation area and my mother's 40 acres were connected somehow." Sarah took the documents, her trained eye scanning the legal language with practiced efficiency. "It's a conservation easement from 2005, she confirmed. "Placed on Mom's 40 acres that adjoins the eastern boundary of the Blackwood Ranch." Her eyes widened as she read further. "And it grants enforcement authority to the Conservation Area Director," that was Eleanor, "which now passes to her designated successor," Sheriff Whitaker added, a meaningful look at Mason. Mason shook his head in confusion. "I'm not the successor. I don't work for the conservation area." "According to these papers, you are," Sarah said, holding up Eleanor's signed directive. "She appointed you acting director in the event of her incapacity or death, effective immediately. It's all legal, notarized last month." The implications hit Mason like a physical force. Eleanor had methodically prepared for this moment, arranging the legal frameworks that would give him the authority to continue her fight. "So I can issue an order preventing Sterling from accessing the disputed areas?" Mason asked, looking to Sarah for confirmation. "You can do more than that," she replied, her expression shifting from grief to determined focus. "This easement contains a water protection clause. Any activity that threatens the watershed can be immediately halted by the director. No court order needed." Sheriff Whitaker's radio crackled with an urgent update from his deputies. "Sterling's crews have reached the Ravine system. They're setting up for excavation now." "I need to get out there," Mason said, gathering the crucial documents. "Can you drive me?" The sheriff nodded. "My cruiser's outside. But Mason, Sterling's got private security on site. This could get ugly." "I'll come too," Sarah stated firmly, already collecting her things. "You'll need a lawyer present to serve the cease and desist." Mason looked at his sister with newfound appreciation. The corporate attorney who had served Sterling's interests was gone, replaced by the Blackwood heir reclaiming her family's purpose. "What about Eleanor?" Mason asked, glancing toward the morgue. "I've spoken with Collins Funeral Home," Sheriff Whitaker assured him. "They're sending someone over now. Eleanor will be taken care of with dignity." The three moved swiftly through the hospital corridors and out into the storm-lashed parking lot. The sheriff's cruiser waited, emergency lights casting rhythmic patterns through the curtain of rain. As they pulled away from the hospital, Mason found himself caught between worlds. The personal earthquake of discovering Eleanor was his biological mother, and the urgent crisis demanding immediate action. There would be time later to process the revelation that had rewritten his understanding of his own life. For now, Eleanor's last mission required his complete focus. The drive to the disputed boundary took them through Stone Creek's modest downtown, where signs of the previous day's flood were still evident in mud-caked storefronts and debris piled along Main Street. Residents worked together in the rain, clearing mud from buildings and checking on neighbors. The crisis had revealed the community's resilience, its capacity for collective action when faced with natural disaster. "Sterling's counting on everyone being distracted by flood recovery," Sarah observed, watching the cleanup efforts through rain-streaked windows. "He figures no one will notice or care about more mining equipment moving in during an emergency." "He underestimates this town," Sheriff Whitaker replied, navigating carefully around a fallen tree branch. "Always has." As they left the town behind, following the county road that wound through pasture land toward the old Blackwood Ranch, Mason's thoughts turned to the Brahmin herd. Had they weathered the storms safely? The bull had demonstrated remarkable leadership during the first flood, guiding his family to higher ground. Mason hoped the animal's instincts had served them equally well during this latest deluge. The cruiser's tires splashed through standing water as they turned onto a muddy access road. Through the downpour, Mason could make out the shapes of heavy machinery ahead, excavators, dump trucks, and portable generators deployed with military precision. Sterling Mining logos were visible on equipment and on the rain gear of workers moving purposefully through the downpour. "Stop here," Mason instructed. "I don't want them to see us coming until we're ready to serve the order." Sheriff Whitaker pulled the cruiser behind a stand of oak trees that partially screened them from the mining operation. "What's your plan?" Mason reviewed the documents once more, ensuring he understood the authority Eleanor had transferred to him. "I'll issue an immediate cease and desist under the Watershed Protection Clause. Sterling's people will resist, claim we have no jurisdiction." "That's where I come in," Sarah added. "I'll certify that the order is legally binding and inform them of the penalties for non-compliance. And I'll be there to keep the peace," the sheriff concluded, checking his service weapon before returning it to its holster. "But make no mistake, Sterling's security team won't back down easily." Before they could exit the vehicle, a familiar black SUV pulled up beside the mining equipment. Victor Sterling emerged, protected from the elements by an umbrella held by a security guard. Even from this distance, his commanding presence was evident as he directed the operation. "He's here personally," Mason noted. "He must be desperate to extract what he can before we can stop him." "It's not just about the minerals anymore," Sarah said quietly. "It's about winning, beating the Blackwoods one last time." Mason nodded, understanding that the conflict had transcended business long ago. This was the final act in a decades-long tragedy that had begun with a love triangle in their parents' generation and would end with this confrontation in the rain-soaked ravine where it had all started. "Let's finish this," Mason said, opening the cruiser door and stepping into the downpour. They approached the mining operation openly, Sheriff Whitaker leading the way with his badge visible. Workers paused their activities, looking uncertainly between the approaching trio and their employer. Victor Sterling spotted them almost immediately, his expression hardening as he recognized the Blackwood siblings flanking the sheriff. "This is private property," Sterling called out as they approached. "You're trespassing." "Actually, Mr. Sterling, you're the one trespassing," Mason replied, raising his voice to carry over the rain and machinery. "This land falls under a conservation easement with watershed protections." Sterling laughed dismissively. "This is Sterling mining land, as confirmed by county records and verified by multiple surveys." "Falsified surveys," Sarah countered, stepping forward with professional confidence despite the mud clinging to her expensive shoes. "As you well know, since you commissioned them." Sterling's security team moved closer to their employer, hands resting meaningfully on their holstered weapons. Sheriff Whitaker responded by unbuttoning his jacket, providing easier access to his own firearm if needed. "I'm serving you with an immediate cease and desist order," Mason stated, holding out the laminated document Eleanor had prepared. "As acting director of the Stone Creek Conservation Area, I am exercising emergency authority under water protection statutes to halt all extraction activities pending environmental review." Sterling made no move to accept the document. "Your conservation director died an hour ago." "Her authority died with her. Eleanor Chambers appointed Mason Blackwood as her successor before her death," Sarah responded, producing the notarized directive. "The appointment was filed with the county clerk this morning. It's legally binding, effective immediately." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Sterling's face, the first indication that Eleanor's meticulous planning had anticipated his moves. He recovered quickly, turning to address his operation manager. "Continue work. If they interfere, have security remove them." Sheriff Whitaker stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, interference with the lawful execution of a conservation order is a criminal offense. Don't make me arrest you in front of your employees." The standoff intensified, rain pounding around them, neither side willing to back down. Mason could feel the weight of the moment. Decades of conflict distilled into this rain-soaked confrontation between families, between values, between visions for Stone Creek's future. Before Sterling could respond, a new sound cut through the downpour, the distinctive low bellow of a Brahman bull. All heads turned toward the ridge overlooking the mining operation where the massive silver-gray form of the herd bull had appeared, silhouetted against the stormy sky. Behind him, the rest of the herd gradually came into view. Cows, calves, and younger bulls, including the rescued calf from the previous day, now moving with greater strength despite its injured leg. The animals stood in silent judgment of the human conflict below, their presence a powerful reminder of what was truly at stake. "Your father's cattle," Sterling spat, glaring at Mason, always more concerned with beasts than progress. "Those cattle represent the true wealth of this land," Mason replied. "Sustainable, renewable, alive. Not extracted, depleted, and poisoned." Something shifted in Sterling's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even regret, quickly submerged beneath calculated pragmatism. "You can't stop what's coming, Mason. The world needs what's under this ground. Rare earth minerals essential for medical equipment, for technology that saves lives." "Technology that might have saved your son," Mason acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. "I understand your motivation, Mr. Sterling, but poisoning other people's children won't bring him back." The personal reference struck home. Sterling flinched visibly, his carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal the grieving father beneath the corporate titan. "Michael was brilliant," Sterling said quietly, almost to himself. "The treatments existed, but the materials to make the equipment were too rare, too expensive. By the time we found a compatible machine in Europe—" He trailed off, lost momentarily in painful memory. Sarah stepped closer, her expression compassionate despite their adversarial positions. "I remember Michael from school. He was kind to me when Dad lost the ranch, the only person who didn't treat us differently." Sterling nodded. A flash of the man he might have been visible beneath the ruthless businessman he had become. "He had his mother's heart. Nothing of me in him at all, thank God." The moment of human connection hung suspended in the rain-washed air, a brief glimpse into the personal tragedy that had shaped Sterling's relentless pursuit of the minerals beneath Stone Creek soil. For a heartbeat, Mason could almost sympathize with the man who had lost a son and channeled his grief into a mission to extract the materials that might save others. But sympathy couldn't outweigh responsibility. The watershed, the wildlife, the future of Stone Creek itself, all hung in the balance of this moment. "Mr. Sterling," Mason said firmly, "I'm serving this cease and desist order. Your operation is contaminating groundwater and violating property boundaries established in the original land grants. You have 15 minutes to shut down equipment and secure the site before we begin documenting violations for criminal prosecution." Sterling stared at Mason for a long moment, calculation visible in his eyes as he weighed options and outcomes. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he reached out and accepted the laminated order. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he said quietly. "One conservation order won't stop what's coming. The world demands progress." "Progress doesn't require destruction," Mason countered. "There are better ways to extract what's needed, sustainable methods that don't poison the water or destroy the land." "Methods that cost more, take longer, reduce profit margins," Sterling dismissed. "The market won't bear it." "Then change the market," Sarah interjected. "Sterling Mining could lead the industry in sustainable extraction." "Develop the patents, set the standards." She met her former employer's skeptical gaze. "It could be Michael's legacy, healing the earth instead of wounding it." For a moment, something like consideration flickered across Sterling's face. Then the corporate mask returned. He turned to his operation manager. "Shut it down. Secure the equipment." To his security chief, he added, "Document everything. I want witnesses to this interference with lawful business operations." As Sterling's workers began powering down the heavy machinery, the tension in the air gradually dissipated. Sheriff Whitaker stepped away to radio an update to his deputies, while Sarah conferred quietly with the Sterling mining manager about proper shutdown procedures to prevent further environmental damage. Mason found himself alone, watching as the Brahmin herd continued their silent vigil from the ridge. The bull's gaze seemed fixed specifically on him, conveying some message Mason couldn't quite decipher, but nonetheless felt with unexpected clarity. A presence at his side drew Mason's attention. Victor Sterling had approached without his security entourage, his expression unreadable as he too observed the cattle on the ridge. "You look like her, you know," Sterling said without preamble. "Eleanor, same eyes, same stubborn set to your jaw when you're fighting for something." Mason stared at the older man, startled by the observation and its implications. "You knew?" Sterling laughed softly, though there was no humor in the sound. "Of course I knew. The timing, the way Joseph suddenly married that Davidson girl when Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, the way Eleanor never left Stone Creek despite opportunities elsewhere." He shook his head slowly. "I wasn't just Joseph's rival for Eleanor's heart, Mason. I was your father's rival for the right to raise you as a son." The revelation stunned Mason into momentary silence. The triangle between Eleanor, Joseph, and Sterling had been more complex than even his father's letter had revealed. "She chose Joseph," Sterling continued, his voice distant with memory. "Chose him to father her child, to build a life with, even if that life was complicated by necessary fictions. I offered to marry her when she told me about the pregnancy, to give the child my name. She refused." Rain continued falling around them, drumming on the metal surfaces of the idle mining equipment, transforming the ravine floor into a shallow stream that carried silt and secrets toward the wider watershed. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mason finally asked. Sterling studied him with eyes that had seen nearly 8 decades of human struggle and compromise. "Because endings matter, Mason. How stories conclude shapes how they're remembered." He gestured toward the mining equipment, now silent and still. "This particular story is ending. I recognize the signs. I've lost too much to keep fighting shadows." "What do you mean?" "Eleanor is gone. The conservation easement will stand. Your sister has turned against me with enough evidence to keep my lawyers busy for years." Sterling smiled thinly. "I'm 78 years old, Mason. I don't have years." Something in Sterling's tone, a finality beyond the immediate defeat, caught Mason's attention. "What aren't you saying?" The older man turned his gaze back to the Brahmin herd on the ridge. "The same thing that took Eleanor is working its way through me. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less." The admission shifted Mason's perception of the conflict yet again. Sterling wasn't just fighting for profit or vengeance, he was racing his own mortality, trying to secure a legacy before time ran out. "I'm sorry," Mason said, and found he genuinely meant it. Sterling acknowledged the sympathy with a slight nod. "Life has a way of bringing us full circle, doesn't it? Eleanor and I facing the same end after all these years of opposition." He turned to face Mason directly. "I've instructed my board to enter negotiations with the conservation area regarding disputed boundaries. They'll reach out next week." The unexpected concession took Mason by surprise. "Why?" "Call it a deathbed conversion if you like," Sterling replied with a hint of his old acerbity. "Or perhaps just recognition that some battles can't be won." He glanced toward Sarah, who was still engaged with the site manager. "Your sister suggested Sterling mining could lead in sustainable extraction practices. She might be right." Michael would have thought so. With that, Sterling turned and walked back toward his waiting SUV, a solitary figure diminished by rain and revelation and the weight of approaching endings. Mason watched him go, this man who had been enemy, almost father, and now something indefinable, neither friend nor foe but a complex player in the story of Stone Creek and the Blackwood legacy. Sheriff Whitaker rejoined Mason as Sterling's vehicle pulled away. "Everything okay?" Mason nodded slowly, still processing the conversation. "I think so." "Sterling's backing down, for now at least." "Never thought I'd see the day," the sheriff remarked. "What changed his mind?" Mason looked toward the ridge where the Brahmin herd still stood, witnessing the human drama below with ancient bovine wisdom. "Time," he answered simply. "The one opponent none of us can beat." Sarah approached, mud spattered but triumphant. "They're complying with the shutdown order." "Full environmental assessment team can access the site tomorrow." She followed Mason's gaze toward the departing Sterling vehicle. "What did he say to you?" "That endings matter," Mason replied, "and that he's dying too." Sarah absorbed this information with visible shock. "Cancer?" Mason nodded. "Same as Eleanor. He's instructed his board to negotiate on the boundary disputes." The three stood in silence as the rain gradually began to ease, the storm system finally moving eastward after days of circling Stone Creek County. Weak sunlight broke through gaps in the clouds, illuminating the ravine in dappled patterns of light and shadow. On the ridge, the Brahmin bull turned away from the human activity below, leading his herd back toward the protected grasslands of the conservation area. The injured calf, moving more confidently now, followed close beside its mother. One by one, the silver-gray shapes disappeared over the horizon, returning to the land that had sustained their bloodline through generations of Blackwood stewardship. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly. Mason watched the last of the cattle disappear from view, carrying Joseph Blackwood's legacy into a future that seemed for the first time in decades filled with possibility rather than threat. "Now we rebuild," he answered simply. "The land, the herd, the family." He looked at his sister. "Everything that matters." As they walked back toward the sheriff's cruiser, Mason felt Eleanor's presence, not as a ghost or spirit, but as the undeniable imprint of her life's work on the land around them. His mother in blood and bond, she had protected his inheritance until he was ready to claim it. Now that task fell to him, a responsibility that felt not like a burden but a birthright too long denied. The rain stopped completely as they reached the vehicle, the clouds continuing to part, revealing patches of blue sky above Stone Creek County. Water dripped from leaves and grasses, each droplet catching the emerging sunlight like tiny prisms, transforming the flood-scoured landscape into a glittering tapestry of renewal and possibility. Sarah paused before entering the cruiser, her gaze sweeping across the land that had shaped both their lives, land they had nearly lost and now had a chance to reclaim. "Eleanor would have loved this moment," she said softly. "The mining equipment silent, the storm passing, the cattle safe." Mason nodded, feeling an unexpected peace settling over him despite the grief and revelations of the day. "She saw it coming," he replied. "Everything she did, the easements, the documentation, appointing me as successor, she was building toward this moment, making sure we'd have the tools to finish what she and Dad started." "What will you do about the conservation director position?" Sheriff Whitaker asked as they climbed into the vehicle. "The county will need to appoint someone permanent." Mason exchanged a glance with Sarah, an unspoken understanding passing between the Blackwood siblings. "I think I might know someone with the right qualifications," he said. "Someone with legal expertise, environmental concerns, and deep roots in Stone Creek County." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but the hint of a smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Are you offering me a job, little brother?" "Just thinking aloud," Mason replied with the first genuine smile he'd managed since Eleanor's collapse. "About possibilities." As the sheriff's cruiser pulled away from the silent mining operation, heading back toward town and the complicated work of rebuilding that awaited them, Mason felt something shift within the landscape of his own identity. Pieces, long disconnected, falling into alignment, creating a picture more complete than he had ever imagined possible. Eleanor Chambers had been his mother. Joseph Blackwood had been his father in every way that mattered. Their legacy of love, sacrifice, and stewardship was now his to carry forward, not alone, but with his sister at his side and the support of a community rediscovering its voice after decades of Sterling's influence. The Blackwood Brahmins would continue to roam the protected land, living symbols of persistence and adaptation. The waters would gradually clear as contamination sources were addressed. And Stone Creek County would find a new balance between progress and preservation, guided by the lessons of the past, but not imprisoned by its conflicts. As the cruiser crested a hill, offering a panoramic view of the land stretching toward the horizon, Mason silently renewed his promise to Eleanor and Joseph, to protect what mattered, to heal what had been wounded, to preserve what must endure. Some inheritance came in the form of land and cattle, some in the form of responsibility and purpose. Mason Blackwood had received both, along with the truth that had eluded him for 42 years. He was his parents' son, all of his parents, and he was finally home. 6 months had transformed Stone Creek County. Spring rains had brought healing green to flood-scoured landscapes, wildflowers blooming in profusion across pastures that had been brown and desperate the previous summer. The town itself wore a fresh face, storefronts repainted, roads repaired, a sense of renewal permeating the community that had weathered both natural disaster and corporate conflict. Mason Blackwood stood on the ridge that marked the eastern boundary of what was once more officially recognized as Blackwood land, watching the Brahmin herd grazing peacefully in the valley below. The massive bull lifted its head occasionally, checking its surroundings with the vigilance that had protected the bloodline through years of uncertainty. Nearby, the once injured calf, now a sturdy juvenile, played with other young cattle, its distinctive triangular ear notch visible even at this distance. "They're thriving," Sarah observed, joining her brother on the ridge. The past months had softened her corporate polish, replaced designer suits with practical ranch wear that would have pleased their father. The change wasn't just external. Her eyes had lost the guarded calculation that years with Sterling Mining had cultivated, revealing more of the passionate young woman who had once helped birth calves in midnight emergencies. "Up to 34 head now," Mason replied with quiet pride. "2 new calves last week. The bloodline secure." The restoration of the Blackwood herd had become Mason's personal mission, locating scattered animals with the distinctive notch that had been sold to various ranches, negotiating their return, re-establishing the breeding program their father had pioneered. It was painstaking work, but deeply satisfying in a way his veterinary practice had never quite achieved. Sarah gestured toward the valley's far end, where construction equipment, not for mining but for restoration, worked to return the damaged ravine system to its natural state. Environmental team says the water quality's improving faster than they projected. Another year and the contamination levels should be within safe limits. The transformation of Stone Creek's environmental outlook had been Sarah's domain. As the newly appointed director of the Eleanor Chambers Conservation Area, expanded now to include the reclaimed Blackwood boundaries, she had leveraged her legal expertise to secure unprecedented concessions from Sterling Mining before Victor Sterling's death 2 months earlier. The old man had kept his word, instructing his board to negotiate a comprehensive settlement that included boundary corrections, cleanup funding, and the revolutionary sustainable extraction protocols that would become known in the industry as the Sterling Standard. His final act had been to establish the Michael Sterling Foundation, dedicated to developing medical technologies that required fewer rare earth minerals, a fitting legacy for the son whose loss had driven his most destructive and constructive actions alike. "Have you decided about the veterinary clinic?" Sarah asked, changing the subject as they walked along the ridgeline, following a path their father had walked countless times during his stewardship of the land. Mason nodded, the decision having settled comfortably in his mind over the preceding weeks. "Signing the lease next week, the old Wilson place on Main Street. Enough space for large and small animal practice." The return to veterinary medicine had come gradually, beginning with his care for the Brahman herd and expanding as word spread through the county that Dr. Blackwood was practicing again. Informal consultations had become regular calls for assistance, until the logical next step was to establish a proper clinic serving the community that had welcomed him back into his professional identity. "Dad would be proud," Sarah said, voicing the sentiment that often passed between them these days, a healing acknowledgement of their father's legacy without the weight of recrimination that had once characterized their different relationships with his memory. "Eleanor, too," Mason added, the name coming more easily now. The complex emotions surrounding her dual role as mentor and biological mother having gradually resolved into simple gratitude for her presence in his life, however complicated by necessity. They reached the limestone outcropping that marked the highest point on Blackwood land, offering a panoramic view of Stone Creek County stretching toward the distant town. Here, 3 months earlier, they had scattered Eleanor's ashes according to instructions left in her will, returning her to the land she had spent a lifetime protecting, to rest near the man she had loved through separation and circumstance. A simple granite marker, installed with Sheriff Whitaker's help, bore a single inscription: "Eleanor Chambers Blackwood. She preserved what mattered." Mason touched the sun-warmed stone briefly, a habit he'd developed during regular visits to this spot. Below, the Brahman bull had led his herd to the clear-running creek that gave the county its name, the animals drinking from water that grew cleaner with each passing month. "Town council meeting tonight," Sarah reminded him, checking her watch. "They're voting on the Sustainable Development Ordinance." The proposed ordinance represented Stone Creek's new direction, balancing economic needs with environmental protection through careful zoning and impact requirements. After decades of Sterling mining's dominance, the community was reclaiming its voice in determining its own future. "I'll be there," Mason assured her. "Just want to check the north pasture fence first. Sheriff Whitaker mentioned some trespassing issues near the old mine entrance." The sheriff had become a close ally in the months following Eleanor's death, his long-standing friendship with their father providing a connection to the Stone Creek that had existed before Sterling's influence had divided the community. His institutional memory and quiet authority had proved invaluable during the transition away from mining dependence. "I'll head back and prepare my presentation," Sarah said. "The Sterling Mining legal team is sending a representative, but I don't anticipate serious opposition. Their new CEO seems genuinely committed to the sustainable approach." They parted ways at the trail junction, Sarah heading toward her modest office in the conservation area headquarters, Mason continuing along the ridge toward the section of the property that bordered what remained of Sterling Mining's operations. The company had undergone its own transformation following Victor Sterling's death. New leadership, coupled with the binding agreements Sarah had negotiated, had shifted its focus from maximum extraction toward selective, low-impact operations that prioritized environmental stability. The change had initially cost jobs, but the diversification of Stone Creek's economy, including the restoration projects, expanded conservation area, and renewed ranching operations, had gradually absorbed the displaced workers. As Mason approached the north pasture, movement in the tree line caught his attention. He paused, watching as a doe and two fawns emerged cautiously from the forest edge, testing the air before moving toward the creek. Wildlife had returned to the healing landscape with surprising speed, nature reclaiming space as contamination levels decreased and habitat improved. The radio on Mason's belt crackled to life. "Mason, you there?" Sheriff Whitaker's voice came through with the slight distortion of rural reception. "I'm here, Tom, up by the north fence line. Got a situation you might want to see. Johnson's Creek Bridge, west side. Nothing urgent, but interesting given recent events." Mason changed direction, curious about the sheriff's deliberately vague description. Johnson's Creek marked the western boundary of Blackwood land, separating it from the small farms that had once been part of the original ranch before being sold off during financial hardships in the 1970s. The walk took 20 minutes, carrying him through stands of oak and mesquite that had survived both drought and flood to emerge more firmly rooted than before. Like Stone Creek itself, the native vegetation demonstrated remarkable resilience when given the chance to recover. As he approached the bridge, rebuilt after the flood with county emergency funds, Mason spotted Sheriff Whitaker's cruiser parked on the far side. The sheriff himself stood watching something in the creek bed below, his expression thoughtful. "Afternoon, Tom," Mason called, crossing the new wooden structure. "What's interesting enough to pull you away from paperwork?" Sheriff Whitaker pointed toward the creek, where clear water now flowed steadily over stones that had been dry for years before the watershed restoration began. "Take a look at your visitors." Mason followed his gesture and felt a surge of surprise and satisfaction. There, drinking calmly from the creek, stood 3 Brahman cattle, 2 cows and a yearling bull, each bearing the distinctive triangular ear notch of the Blackwood herd. But these weren't animals from the main herd Mason had been carefully rebuilding. These were new discoveries, survivors from the dispersed bloodline finding their own way home. "Where did they come from?" Mason asked, keeping his voice low to avoid startling the cattle. "Jenkins' farm would be my guess," the sheriff replied. "Old man Jenkins mentioned seeing strange cattle on his back 40 last week. Thought he was imagining things until his grandson took photos." The Jenkins property lay 5 miles west, a considerable distance for cattle to travel independently, especially crossing other farms and roads in the process. Yet here they were, drawn to water that ran through Blackwood land as if some genetic memory had guided them home. "They're in good condition," Mason observed with professional approval. "Someone's been caring for them even if they didn't recognize the bloodline." The sheriff nodded. "Jenkins isn't much of a cattleman. Focuses on hay production mostly. Said they just showed up after the spring rains, and he didn't have the heart to chase them off when they weren't causing damage." Mason slowly descended the bank toward the creek, using the careful approach he'd developed working with semi-wild cattle. The animals watched him warily but didn't flee, the Brahman breed's natural intelligence evident in their assessment of this human entering their space. "Hey there," Mason called softly, using the same gentle tone his father had employed with nervous cattle. "Welcome home." The yearling bull snorted softly, ears flicking forward with interest rather than alarm. Something in Mason's scent or voice seemed to register with the animal, a recognition that transcended the usual wariness of cattle toward strangers. "That's remarkable," Sheriff Whitaker commented from the bridge. "It's like they know you." "They know Blackwood land," Mason corrected, though he felt the same sense of connection. "This creek has watered our cattle for generations. Maybe water holds memory too." The sheriff chuckled at the poetic notion, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Your father used to say something similar. That land and animals remember what people forget." Mason nodded, letting the cattle grow accustomed to his presence without pressing closer. He would return with proper equipment to check their health and identification before integrating them into the main herd. For now, it was enough to witness their instinctive return to Blackwood water. "I'll contact Jenkins, work out fair compensation," Mason said as he climbed back up to the bridge. "These three make 37 head now." Getting closer to the size of Dad's original breeding program. "One step at a time," the sheriff agreed, heading back to his cruiser. "Speaking of steps, I'd better get back to town. Hearing some rumors about developers eyeing the old Sterling property now that the mining operations are scaling down." Mason frowned slightly. "Sarah mentioned Sterling Mining was sending a representative to tonight's council meeting. Could be related." "I'll see you there," Sheriff Whitaker said, opening his car door. 7 o'clock sharp. Sarah's presenting first, then public comments." As the sheriff's cruiser pulled away, Mason remained on the bridge a moment longer, watching the Brahman cattle return to grazing along the creek bank, at home in a landscape their ancestors had helped shape through generations of selective breeding and adaptation. The discovery felt symbolic of Stone Creek's broader healing, scattered elements finding their way back to original patterns, reconstituting something that had been broken but never completely lost. The Blackwood bloodline, like the community itself, proved more resilient than those who had sought to disperse and replace it had anticipated. Mason checked his watch and began the walk back toward the ranch house, the original Blackwood homestead that they had managed to repurchase from the bank 3 months earlier. The modest structure had required extensive renovation after years of neglect, but its bones were sound, built by their great-grandfather to withstand Texas storms and summer heat alike. Sarah had initially planned to maintain her apartment in town, but as the work of restoration deepened, she had gradually moved more of her life to the ranch, finally admitting what Mason had suspected, that healing their relationship with the land required living directly upon it, experiencing its daily rhythms and demands. The town council meeting would mark another milestone in Stone Creek's transformation, formalizing the balanced approach to development that Eleanor had advocated throughout her life. Mason felt a familiar mix of pride and melancholy at the thought. Eleanor should have lived to see this day, to witness the community reclaiming its voice and charting a sustainable course forward. Yet, in another sense, she was witnessing it. Through the conservation area that bore her name, through the policies she had shaped, and through the son who carried forward her work while finally knowing the full truth of their connection. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Mason reached the ranch house, its freshly painted exterior gleaming white against the Texas landscape. On the porch, Sarah had left files prepared for the evening's presentation, neatly organized with her characteristic precision. Mason showered and changed, replacing work clothes with more appropriate attire for the council meeting. As he buttoned a clean shirt, his gaze fell on the photographs arranged on his dresser, images that traced the Blackwood history through generations. His father astride a prized Brahman bull at a county fair in the 1970s, young and confident. His mother, the woman who had raised him as her own, smiling from the porch of this very house, a toddler Mason on her hip. And now, added to the family gallery, a photograph of Eleanor that Sheriff Whitaker had provided from county archives. Eleanor in her 30s, standing proudly beside a conservation area boundary marker, her eyes holding the same determined expression Mason sometimes caught in his own reflection. The past had been complicated, filled with necessary secrets and painful compromises, but the future taking shape in Stone Creek offered something cleaner, more honest, a community acknowledging both its wounds and its potential, choosing a path that honored what had been lost, while creating something new and sustainable. Mason picked up the presentation materials Sarah had prepared and headed for his truck. The council meeting awaited, another step in the long journey of restoration that had become his unexpected calling. The Brahmin cattle would continue finding their way home, guided by instincts deeper than human understanding. The land would continue healing, patient with the time frame of natural processes, and the Blackwood legacy would continue through Mason and Sarah's stewardship, not as a burden of the past, but as a gift to Stone Creek's future. Eleanor and Joseph had preserved what mattered until their children were ready to carry it forward. Now that time had come. As Mason drove toward town, the setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, transforming ordinary pastures and modest farmhouses into something luminous and precious. This light, this land, these people, all worth fighting for, worth preserving against forces that valued extraction over sustainability. The heart of Stone Creek came into view. The courthouse square with its century-old oak trees, the small businesses that had weathered economic upheaval, the community gathering spaces where decisions affecting everyone would be thoughtfully considered rather than dictated by distant corporate interests. Mason parked near the town hall, noting the unusually full parking lot, evidence of renewed civic engagement following Sterling Mining's diminished influence. Citizens who had once felt powerless against corporate money and political connections were reclaiming their voice in determining Stone Creek's direction. Inside, the meeting room was already nearly full. Mason spotted familiar faces, ranchers who had begun adopting sustainable practices, teachers whose environmental curriculum now included field trips to the conservation area, young families drawn to Stone Creek's renewed commitment to clean water and protected green spaces. Sarah stood near the podium, reviewing her notes one final time. She looked up as Mason entered, offering a smile that reflected their shared journey from estrangement to partnership. The Blackwood siblings had found their way back to each other, just as the scattered cattle had found their way back to Blackwood land. "Ready?" Mason asked, joining her at the front of the room. Sarah nodded, confidence evident in her posture. "More than ready. Stone Creek's waited long enough for this day." As the council members took their seats and called the meeting to order, Mason settled into a chair in the front row. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, and there would be many in balancing progress with preservation, Stone Creek County had reclaimed the essential power to determine its own future. The land that Eleanor and Joseph had fought to protect would continue sustaining the community, offering lessons in resilience and renewal to those willing to listen. The council chairman gavelled the meeting to order, and Sarah approached the podium to present the Sustainable Development Ordinance that would shape Stone Creek for generations to come. Mason watched with quiet pride as his sister articulated the vision that had once seemed impossible against Sterling's influence. A vision of prosperity that didn't require destruction, of progress that respected the past while creating a viable future. Through the meeting room's windows, Mason could see the last golden light of day illuminating the town square. Somewhere beyond those ancient oaks, Blackwood land waited, and on that land, Brahmin cattle grazed beside clear-running creeks, their bloodline unbroken despite all attempts to scatter it. Some legacies survived against all odds. Some promises endured beyond death. Some land remembered its true stewards, calling them home when the time was right. Mason Blackwood had answered that call, returning to the place and purpose that had shaped his family for generations. In doing so, he had discovered truths both painful and precious about his parentage, about Eleanor's sacrifice, about the complicated love that had ultimately preserved what mattered most. Now, as Stone Creek County embarked on a new chapter, that preservation would continue, not through one person's heroic efforts, but through a community awakened to its responsibility toward the land that sustained it. The path forward would require vigilance, compromise, and constant balancing of competing needs. But for the first time in decades, that path would be chosen by many voices rather than dictated by corporate might. As Sarah concluded her presentation to appreciative applause, Mason felt a sense of completion, not an ending but a circle properly closed, allowing new beginnings to emerge. Eleanor would have understood, Joseph would have approved, and the land itself, resilient despite all it had endured, would continue teaching its timeless lessons to those wise enough to listen. The Brahman bull bellowed across Blackwood pastures, calling its scattered family home. Stone Creek flowed clear again, nourishing the watershed that gave the county its name. And in the town hall, citizens gathered to protect what had nearly been lost: their voice, their water, their future. Some inheritance came in the form of cattle and land, some in the form of responsibility and wisdom. Mason Blackwood had received both, along with the truth that had eluded him for decades. The rangers had rushed to hear a bull's cry from a ravine, and nature had indeed delivered an unbelievable twist, revealing not just a lost bloodline, but a lost heritage, returning both to where they belonged. Mason smiled as citizens lined up to offer their perspectives on the ordinance that would protect Stone Creek's watershed for generations to come. Eleanor would have loved this moment, the community engaged, the future being shaped by many hands rather than corporate dictate. In a very real sense, she was present through her legacy, through the land she had protected, and through the son who carried forward her work with newly discovered purpose. The meeting continued into the evening, democracy in its messy, vital form unfolding in real time. Outside, stars appeared above Stone Creek, the same stars that had guided generations of Blackwoods across their land. The constellations remained constant, even as the earth beneath them transformed through seasons of loss and renewal. Mason Blackwood had found his place among those stars, a fixed point in a changing landscape, rooted in legacy, yet facing forward toward a future full of possibility. The bull's cry from the ravine had led him home at last. In Stone Creek County, Mason Blackwood's journey reminds us that it's never too late to come home to what truly matters. Like Mason, many of us reach our 50s and 60s wondering if we've wandered too far from our roots, if family rifts can ever truly heal, or if our life's work will endure beyond us. This story speaks to that quiet worry in our hearts. Eleanor's sacrifice, placing her child's future above her own happiness, echoes the silent gifts many of us have given our children. The Brahman cattle, finding their way home across miles of unfamiliar territory, mirrors our own yearning to reconnect with what's authentic in our lives. Remember, Mason was 42 when he discovered his true purpose in parentage. At 55, 60, or 68, we too can rediscover what calls to us, can mend broken family bonds, can leave a legacy that honors the land and people we love. What relationship in your life needs healing before it's too late? What legacy are you creating that will outlive you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're never too old to find our way home, never too broken to begin again.